Chapter 1355. Nar was never a person who liked to accept his fate. After confirming that Qin Chuan would not show mercy, he did not say anything to beg for mercy to Qin Chuan. Instead, he directly chose to fight with his life. Woo woo woo. Waves of void power emerged from Nar's body and instantly filled the entire command center. Even with Qin Chuan's eyesight, it was difficult to see the scene within a radius of 10 meters at this time. If Nar wanted to take the opportunity to escape, Qin Chuan was afraid that it would be difficult to see. However, Qin Chuan never used his eyes to lock onto Nar, but used his mental power. In front of Qin Chuan's mental power, Nar's every move was seen. To Qin Chuan's surprise, Nar did not intend to escape. Instead, he prepared to kill Qin Chuan. The flesh and blood on Nar's body gradually collapsed and dissipated. He was the same as the opponents that Qin Chuan had encountered before. They all turned into the appearance of a blood spirit. Obviously, the blood spirit state was Nar's strongest state. As a second-grade wizard, Nar was best at witchcraft. When the void power confused Qin Chuan's vision, he immediately cast witchcraft on Qin Chuan one after another. Power dissipated, lost vision, hearing, touch, taste, and sound. Life withering. Nar cast 3 witchcraft on Qin Chuan almost without any pause. These 3 witchcraft targeted Qin Chuan's strength, 5 senses, and life. Although Nar felt that these methods could not kill Qin Chuan, it should not be a problem to weaken Qin Chuan's strength. Nar knew that Qin Chuan was not a demigod yet. Although Qin Chuan was extremely strong, his strength was still at the crossing calamity stage. As long as he could weaken Qin Chuan's strength to a certain extent, he would have a chance to defeat Qin Chuan. As the witchcraft cast by Nar fell on Qin Chuan suddenly felt that his strength had become much weaker. At the same time, his vision began to blur, his hearing was also a little reduced, his mouth was tasteless, and his perception of the outside world became dull. He wanted to make some sounds, but he felt as if his throat was blocked. He could only make some low and hoarse sounds, unable to say a coherent sentence. Moreover, the most important thing was that Qin Chuan felt that his vitality was slowly fading. In just a moment, he felt that he had lost more than 5 years of his life. This was the first time Qin Chuan faced a wizard, and the first time he personally felt the power of a wizard. This made him feel like he was facing the one God religion's law of words. It was a different approach to achieve the same result. However, compared to the law of words, there were still some differences between witchcraft and law of words. Witchcraft targeted only the human body. In other words, no matter what the effect of witchcraft was, it had to start from a human body. For example, getting sick or sealing the 5 senses had to be carried out around the human body. Law of words was different. Law of words could not only target the human body, but it could even change the environment. For example, lightning punishment from the sky, or a mountain of knives and a sea of fire. However, correspondingly, the price to pay for casting witchcraft and law of words was different. Casting witchcraft required the user's own strength and the power of law. Law of words required the user to pay the price of vitality, which was more dangerous. Of course, law of words was still stronger in terms of power. Qin Chuan was quietly feeling the power of witchcraft, while Nar took the opportunity to directly rush towards Qin Chuan, wanting to give Qin Chuan a fatal blow. Although magi were good at magic, if one thought that magi were not good at close combat, because of this, they would be looking down on magi too much. Some magi's physique was even comparable to warriors of the same rank. And Nar was such an adept. Whoosh! Nar, who had turned into a blood spirit, approached Qin Chuan and reached out his hand towards Qin Chuan's heart. Just as he was about to touch Qin Chuan, a round figure suddenly appeared in front of Qin Chuan's chest and blocked Nar's attack. Dong! The little armored dragon rubbed its belly, bared its fangs and brandished its claws at Nar, and said fiercely, "I'll eat you." As it spoke, the little armored dragon opened its mouth at Nar, and immediately, an extremely strong suction force erupted from the little armored dragon's mouth. The void energy surrounding Nar immediately flew uncontrollably towards the little armored dragon's mouth. Nar was shocked when he saw this scene. He wanted to stop the little armor dragon, but his attack had no effect on the little armor dragon at all. As for his witchcraft, it was also ineffective. Seeing that the little armor dragon had already devoured most of his strength, Nar was shocked and angry, but there was nothing he could do. When the little armor dragon was satisfied with a burp and closed its mouth, Nar had almost been sucked dry by the little armor dragon. At this time, there were only 2 or 3 wisps of void energy surrounding Nar. The blood on Nar's body had also dimmed and lost its luster. His entire body was emitting a heavy aura of death. At this time, Nar had lost almost all of his strength. He couldn't even escape. Now, he was like a fish on the chopping board, waiting to be slaughtered. The culprit who caused him to become like this had a comfortable expression on his face at this time. He looked at the little armored dragon with an extremely resentful gaze. He hated the little armored dragon to the core. If it wasn't for the little armored dragon's interference, he might have already killed Qinchuan and made a great contribution. Just as Nar was roaring madly in his heart, Qinchuan slowly opened his eyes and looked at Nar. He smiled slightly and said, "Your witchcraft is not bad, but unfortunately, it's not very useful." As he spoke, Qinchuan's body shook slightly, dispelling the witchcraft and returning to normal. Seeing this scene, Nar cried out in shock, "This is impossible." Qinchuan looked at Nar and said calmly, "Nothing is impossible. It's just time reversal. You know that." Hearing Qinchuan's explanation, Nar's face suddenly showed a touch of despair. Qinchuan rarely used the power of the law of time, but this didn't mean that Nar didn't know that Qinchuan controlled the power of the law of time. If he knew that this would be the result, he would have escaped directly instead of dreaming of killing Qinchuan. However, it was too late to say anything now. Qinchuan didn't give Nar a chance to say any last words. He raised his hand and slapped Nar into ashes. Then, he burned down Nar's command center. In the raging fire, Qinchuan carried the little armored dragon out of the fire and looked around. Under Qin Zhu's command, under the command of Lu Zi and Zhou Lin, the 1 billion troops of the Endless Alliance Army were besieging the 6 billion expeditionary army of the Void Empire. After this battle, the expeditionary army of the Void Empire would no longer exist. It was time for him to put an end to this war. Chapter 1356. The Void Empire's expeditionary army had more than 6 billion soldiers. After losing their commander, Narway, they were like a plate of loose sand. The strength of an individual's strength was not worth mentioning in front of a team's cooperation. This was the first time Qin Zhu had personally commanded more than 1 billion people in battle, but her performance was extremely outstanding. Under Qin Zhu's command, the 1 billion soldiers of the Endless Alliance Army besieged the Void Empire's expeditionary army, which had more than 6 billion soldiers in a heavenly void continent. They carried out the plan of destruction in an orderly manner. After 3 days, less than 2 billion soldiers of the Void Empire's expeditionary army were left. Although the Endless Alliance Army's 1 billion soldiers had suffered some losses, compared to the gains, this loss was not worth mentioning. In these 3 days, the surviving soldiers of the Void Empire's expeditionary army had been completely defeated. Whether it was physically or mentally, they had given up resisting. They wanted to surrender and become captives of the Endless Alliance Army. However, before the battle began, Qinchuan had already issued an order. Don't take any prisoners. This was a massacre, a one-sided massacre. Qinchuan stood in the sky above the heavenly void continent and looked down at the battlefield. He watched as the soldiers of the Void Empire's expeditionary army fell into pools of blood one by one. Some struggled in despair and pain, slowly exhausting their remaining vitality. Then they died or exploded in despair, using self-destruction to attack the surrounding enemies. The blood of more than 4 billion people had already dyed the heavenly void continent a deep purple. Looking at the scene in front of him, Qinchuan pursed his lips and asked Lu Zi, who was standing beside him, "Am I very heartless and cruel? These people had clearly surrendered, but I still chose to kill them. I didn't let a single one of them go." Hearing Qinchuan's words, Lu Zi shook her head gently and said, "It's the war that's cruel, not you. I believe that if we were in their shoes, they would also raise their butcher's knife to us who surrendered, because we all know very well that being merciful to the enemy is being cruel to ourselves." Qinchuan sighed softly when he heard this. He knew that Lu Zi was right, and he knew that he was not wrong to do so. However, it was really difficult to remain indifferent to watching billions of lives die in front of him. Those who are not of our race must have a different heart. Zhou Lin slowly walked over from afar. She looked coldly at Qinchuan and said indifferently, "Look at the blood flowing in their veins. It's a demonic purple, while we humans and demons are bright red. Even the blood of some powerful people before their bodies mutated. Of course." Qinchuan slowly turned his head and looked at Zhou Lin with that. He asked gently, "Senior, do you think they all deserve to die?" Zhou Lin nodded. "If they don't die, we'll be in danger of dying. As a result, this is a multiple-choice question with an obvious answer." With that, Zhou Lin glanced at Qinchuan in a subtle manner and said, "I think you're a little too pretentious at times." In Zhou Lin's eyes, Qinchuan was extremely outstanding in all aspects, but no one was perfect. Qinchuan had his flaws as well, and Qinchuan's flaws were in his personality. A very long time ago, when she first met Qinchuan, Zhou Lin could tell that Qinchuan was a rather pretentious person, or rather, a rather hipster person. He was always sentimental and liked to think about this and that. There were some things that he clearly knew were right and that he should do, but he would always feel sentimental for various reasons, as if he was moaning about nothing. These were all Qinchuan's flaws, but Zhou Lin felt that they were very good. Qinchuan with his flaws seemed like a lively person, a friend that people felt close to. If Qinchuan did not have these flaws in his personality, then he would be a cold and aloof god. With Qinchuan's current strength, status, and reputation, he could be called a god. However, Zhou Lin knew that one day, Qinchuan might possess the power of God, but he would not become one. Qinchuan could not help but reveal a subtle expression when he heard Zhou Lin's words. Zhou Lin's words made a lot of sense, and he did not know how to refute them. "Don't think about how to refute me." Zhou Lin faintly smiled and said to Qinchuan, "If one day you feel that what I said was wrong and hurt you, then use your strength to suppress me." If such a day really came, then Zhou Lin would use her own blood to wake Qinchuan up. She would rather die again than to see Qinchuan become a cold and aloof person. If Qinchuan really became like that, then what was the difference between Qinchuan and you? No matter what I become one day, I will not make a move against Senior's sister. Qinchuan said to Zhou Lin in a very serious tone, "Senior sister, you will always be my senior sister. All right, let's not talk about these heavy topics." Lu Zi smiled and said to Qinchuan, "If you dare to make a move against Senior Sister because she told you the truth, I will be the first to not let you off." It was very rare that Lu Zi did not stand on Qinchuan's side for the first time. Although her trust in Qinchuan was a little blind, and her support for Qinchuan was unconditional, this did not mean that Lu Zi did not have the right view of right and wrong. She could understand Zhou Lin's good intentions. "You too. Don't make it sound like I've become a cold and aloof person, okay?" Qinchuan did not know whether to laugh or cry. The way these two women looked at him was too strange, as if he would fall ill at any moment. "What are you guys talking about?" It seems very lively. At this moment, Qinju, who was wearing a dark green military uniform and a cloak, slowly walked over. She took off the hat on her head, and her black hair fluttered in the wind. She looked valiant and valiant. "Fortunately, I did not disappoint you. After 5 days, the Void Empire's expeditionary army was destroyed." Hearing Qinju's words, Qinchuan turned to look at Qinchuan. He pursed his lips and said, "Auntie, thank you for your hard work. It's not hard at all. This is the first battle I've commanded after joining the Endless Alliance army. It's very meaningful to me." Qinju smiled and said to Qinchuan, "Now, what should we do with the Heavenly Void continent?" The current Heavenly Void continent was already filled with corpses and blood flowed for thousands of miles. The scene on every inch of land was so shocking. Let's stay here for now. I'll ask Alaska later and decide how to deal with the heavenly void continent. Qin Chuan looked at the people around him and said, now that the Void Empire's expeditionary army has been destroyed, we should go back and think about how to negotiate with the demons in Zerg. Chapter 1357. Devil Star. Ever since he reached an agreement with Qin Chuan that day, Ford had been waiting for a result. Today, he finally got the result he wanted. The 6 billion soldiers of the Void Empire Expeditionary Army in the Koth Nebula and the Tianshu continent were annihilated after struggling for 5 days against the encirclement and suppression of the Endless Alliance army. They were completely annihilated. Qin Chuan's cruel and ruthless methods exceeded Ford's expectations. He never expected that Qin Chuan would not take any prisoners of war and directly kill more than 6 billion soldiers of the Void Empire Expeditionary Army. Such methods could no longer be described as simply having a heart of stone. In the past, Ford thought that Qin Chuan was a heroic figure, but now he felt that Qin Chuan was more like an ambitious and ruthless person. 6 billion. More than 6 billion people died in just 5 days. The entire land of the Heavenly Void Land has been dyed a deep purple. This should be the most tragic battle since the start of the war. Looking at all the great wars in history, other than the war of extermination between the demon race and the barbarian race, the war of extermination that Qin Chuan single-handedly controlled should be the bloodiest and cruelest war. Perhaps it was not appropriate to call this war a war. Seriously speaking, this should be a one-sided massacre. Ford could not help but rejoice in his heart. If he had not been willing to cooperate with Qin Chuan back then, perhaps the Devil Star would have become a hell on earth. Marshal, the Endless Alliance army has sent a message asking you to go to the border of the Deus Cluster to discuss the peace talks. The adjutant looked at the complicated expression on Ford's face, and his emotions were also exceptionally complicated. Just a few days ago, he had witnessed the departure of the Void Empire Expeditionary Army with his own eyes. He did not expect that departure to be a farewell forever. However, he did not feel sad about the destruction of the Void Empire Expeditionary Army. He only felt sympathy for them. Right now, the most important thing for them was the peace talks. Only peace talks could resolve all disputes. Let's go then. Ford had never thought of refusing an invitation from the Endless Allied Army. Hearing this, the adjutant hesitantly said, Marshal, are you going to agree just like that? Aren't you afraid of any danger? Hearing the adjutant's words, Ford sighed and said, Then how do you think I won't be in danger? The adjutant was stunned. How could there be no danger? If he couldn't negotiate with the Endless Allied forces, Ford wouldn't be safe no matter where he went unless he hid beside the Magic Emperor. Looking at the stunned adjutant, Ford waved his hand and said, You may leave. Remember to tell the Endless Alliance army that I will set off for the border of the Deus Cluster tomorrow. Yes, I understand. The adjutant left, leaving Ford alone in the office. He got up and walked to the window, looking out at the Devil Star. He could not help but let out a long sigh. If he had known that this day would come, he would not have believed the Void Empire's promise and launched this meaningless war. However, it was too late for that now. Now, retribution was coming. At the border of the Deus Cluster, the Hope was parked alone in space. Qin Chuan and Chun Changxing sat on the deck, while Baiyu made tea for them. Chun Changxing picked up the teacup, took a sip, and asked Baiyu curiously, Baiyu, now that you're the Hope's weapon spirit, is there an end to your lifespan? Hearing Chun Changxing's question, Qin Chuan also looked at Baiyu curiously. He had never thought about this before. Facing Chun Changxing and Qin Chuan's curiosity, Baiyu replied, As long as the Hope isn't destroyed, theoretically speaking, I'm immortal. After hearing Baiyu's answer, Chun Changxing sighed with emotion. Eternal life, I really don't know if I should envy you or not. Sometimes, I yearn for eternal life and eternal life, but other times, I feel that such a life is very boring and dull. You're just bored. Qin Chuan glanced at Chun Changxing and said, When you can really live forever, we'll talk about this. Now, Chun Changxing was only in the middle Dongshu stage, and his lifespan was only about 1,500 years. As for Qin Chuan, he could no longer feel the end of his lifespan. It could be said that he had reached the stage of immortality. Someone's coming. Bai Yu put down the teapot in her hand and looked into the distance. A black shadow was rapidly approaching the Hope. It's Ford. Qin Chuan glanced at the black shadow, then turned to Chun Chongqing and said, "During the negotiation later, you'll be in charge. I'll watch from the sidelines." Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Chun Chongqing was shocked. "I'll be in charge. Boss, you didn't tell me this before." Qin Chuan smiled and said, "You know the conditions of the negotiation. The reason I didn't tell you before was to train your adaptability." Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Chun Chongqing couldn't help but roll his eyes. Train adaptability? Haha. Just as Ford approached the Hope, Qin Chuan's figure retreated into the cabin, leaving the deck to Chun Chongqing. When Ford landed on the Hope and saw Chun Chongqing sitting in front of the tea table, he couldn't help but be stunned. He asked, "You're the representative of the Endless Allied Army?" Hearing this, Chun Chongqing smiled, but in his heart, he didn't know whether to curse or not. Just a minute ago, he wasn't the representative, but now he was. Boss still has a lot of things to take care of. Just leave the small matter of negotiating peace with you demons to me. Chun Chongqing smiled faintly and said, "Why? Do you think a mere middle Dongshu stage cultivator like me isn't qualified to negotiate with you?" Ford shook his head and said, "You're Qin Chuan's brother. You're qualified to negotiate with me." Chun Chongqing pointed to the praying mat on the other side of the tea table and said to Ford, "Please sit." Ford sat down on the praying mat and looked at Bai Yu, who was brewing tea, and said, "I've long heard of the human race's tea ceremony. Today, I finally have the opportunity to taste it. It's my honor." Ford was no stranger to Bai Yu. She was an artifact spirit with intelligence that far surpassed that of ordinary people. Sooner or later, she would grow into a divine artifact. She definitely couldn't be underestimated. "Ford, let's not talk about pleasantries. Our endless allied forces are very sincere in today's negotiation. However, if your demon race can't show us a satisfactory level of sincerity, then there's nothing to talk about." Chun Chongqing's attitude was very high. Now that the endless allied army held the absolute advantage, he naturally couldn't talk to Ford calmly. If he didn't put on a high profile, how could he have the nerve to ask for benefits later? Chapter 1358. Facing Chun Chongqing's arrogant attitude, Ford was a little angry, but he did not show it on the surface. This was because he knew that the Demon Alliance had collapsed, Zerg had retreated, and the Void Empire Expeditionary Army had been destroyed. The Nephilim race was already at an absolute disadvantage. Under such circumstances, it was normal for Chun Chongqing to put on a high profile. It would be strange if Chun Chongqing were to be amiable with him. "I'm here to negotiate on behalf of the Nephilim race with the greatest sincerity. As for the post-war compensation and other conditions, the Nephilim race will do our best to satisfy your requests." One had to lower one's head when under the eaves. Although saying such words would make Ford feel ashamed, he had to put down his pride in order to avoid greater losses. He even took the initiative to put his pride under Chun Chongqing's feet and let Chun Chongqing trample on it, for hadn't felt this kind of humiliation for many years. Hearing Ford's words, Chun Chongqing smiled and said, "Then let's talk about our first condition." At this point, Chun Chongqing paused for a moment, and then said to Ford, "First of all, we need the Nephilim King to publicly apologize to the entire universe in the name of the Nephilim race and repent through a live broadcast. He will admit the sins that the Nephilim race has committed in this war, apologize to those who were killed by your attacks, and apologize to the innocent people who were affected by the flames of war." Hearing Chun Chongqing's words, Ford's expression changed immediately, and he said without hesitation, "That's impossible. As the leader of the Nephilim race, if the Nephilim King really did as Chun Chongqing requested, then the Nephilim King's reputation would definitely suffer an unprecedented blow." Chun Chongqing sneered and said to Ford, "Since you think it's impossible, please go back." Tomorrow, the Endless Alliance army will attack the Devil Planet. Let's fight on the battlefield again. Hearing Chun Chongqing's words, Ford's face suddenly turned ashen. He felt threatened. If you can't make the decision, then contact the Nephilim King. Chun Chongqing saw that Ford was silent, so he said indifferently, Do you want the Demon King to apologize, or do you want to start a war again? You could discuss among yourselves and give me an answer. I'll give you 10 minutes. Ford glanced at Chun Chongqing with an extremely gloomy gaze before getting up and walking towards the end of the deck. Chun Chongqing sat in front of the tea table and watched Ford leave. He let out a sigh of relief and said to Baiyu, If he had directly attacked me just now, would I have died? When he made this request to Fuda, he was very nervous. He was afraid that Fuda would attack him out of anger. He was only at the middle Dongxi realm. It was impossible for him to block Fuda's attack. Baiyu glanced at Qin Chongqing and said, Don't worry. No matter if it's me or Qin Chuan, we'll ensure your safety. Hearing this, Qin Chongqing let out a long sigh of relief and smiled. That's good, that's good. On the other side, Ford had already contacted the Nephilim King and told him about Qin Chongqing's conditions. After saying this, Ford fell silent and waited for the Nephilim King's reply. All along, the Nephilim King had been an extremely proud person. He had never bowed his head to anyone. Even in the face of an existence like the Nephilim King, the Nephilim King could be neither servile nor overbearing. Now, Qin Chongqing, on behalf of the Endless Alliance army, asked the Nephilim King to publicly apologize to the entire universe and repent for his crimes. This was completely trampling on the Nephilim King's face. With Ford's understanding of the Nephilim King, it was absolutely impossible for the Nephilim King to agree to this. However, contrary to Ford's expectations, the Nephilim King actually agreed to Qin Chongqing's request. Tell Qin Chongqing that we agree to this condition. After the peace talks are over, I will apologize to all the people in the universe who have been affected by the war in the form of a live broadcast according to their request and repent for my crimes. Hearing the Nephilim King's words, Ford was shocked and said, Have you really made a decision? Even though he heard it with his own ears, Ford still found it hard to believe. The Nephilim King was silent for a moment before saying to Ford, This is a sacrifice we have to make. Although this condition sounds very harsh, my personal honor is nothing compared to the lives of billions of demons and soldiers. As the soul of the demons, the Nephilim King had always been high and mighty in the hearts of all the demons. This was absolutely correct. Once the Nephilim King publicly apologized and repented, the lofty image of the Nephilim King in the hearts of the demons would inevitably collapse. This would have an immeasurable negative impact on the Nephilim King. However, just as the Nephilim King said, there were some things that he had to do. If the Nephilim King was unwilling to bow his head, then the demons would suffer even more losses. After receiving the Nephilim King's exact answer, Ford returned to a few thousand and said in a low voice, The Nephilim King has agreed to your conditions. Qin Chongqing was not surprised by this. He smiled and said to Ford, Do you think we've gone overboard and that you've been wrong? Without waiting for Ford to speak, Qin Chongqing sneered and said, Do you know why I put this condition as the first condition? Because I want you to know that you can't do whatever you want just because you're in a higher realm. You're always right. We humans have always been reasonable, but it's impossible to be reasonable with you. Therefore, we can only fight with our fists. If you can't beat us with your fists, you'll have to do what we ask you to do. Don't think that your Nephilim King is so selfless and dedicated, as if you've suffered a great loss. As the one who started the war, just asking him to apologize and repent is already being lenient. If I were the boss, I would definitely kill my way to your Nephilim palace and kill the Nephilim King with my own hands. From Qin Chongqing's point of view, as the instigator of the war, the Nephilim King's crime was unforgivable. Others might be able to escape punishment, but the Nephilim King definitely couldn't. In the eyes of others, the Nephilim King was a supreme existence at the transcending tribulation stage, or even a demigod. But in Qin Chongqing's eyes, the Nephilim King was a complete scum. Hearing Chun Chongqing's words, Ford was unable to restrain his anger. He instinctively wanted to attack Chun Chongqing, but at this moment, vines suddenly grew out from under him and tied him up tightly. Baiyu glanced at Ford indifferently and said, Chun Chongqing is right. The Nephilim King is the main culprit, so just asking him to apologize is already letting him off easy. Also, you better stay rational and don't think about attacking. Don't forget that the Nephilim star is behind you. Chapter 1359. Looking at the vines wrapped around his body, the furious Ford gradually calmed down. He clearly knew that if he had made a move just now, even if he had only injured Chun Chongqing, the demons would have suffered a huge loss. Therefore, he was very glad that Baiyu had stopped him in time and poured a bucket of cold water on him. Behind him was the Devil Star, and he carried a huge responsibility. So no matter what, he couldn't be impulsive. Sorry, I was too impulsive just now. Ford took a deep breath and said to Chun Chongqing, Please forgive my reckless behavior. Chun Chongqing smiled and said, It's okay. Let's continue talking. Our second condition is that starting from the end of the peace talks, the demons are not allowed to expand their army for 1,000 years. The demons can only maintain a military strength of 3 billion. Hearing Chun Chongqing's second condition, Ford frowned and said, Only 3 billion? Chun Chongqing nodded and said, Yes, only 3 billion. I think 3 billion troops are enough for you to defend the border. If we find out that you're secretly recruiting and expanding the size of your army, we'll treat it as the demons wanting to restart the war. You should be able to imagine what will happen then. Ford fell silent. After a long time, he asked again, What if the demons are attacked by other forces? Chun Chongqing smiled and said, If there's a conflict, as long as it's not your fault, we'll definitely ensure that your interests won't be infringed. This will be written in the terms. Hearing Chun Chongqing's answer, Ford said, Okay, we agree to the second condition. Then let's talk about the third condition now. Chun Chongqing took a sip of tea and said to Ford, Within 1,000 years, the demons are not allowed to have a new supreme existence at the tribulation transcendent stage. No matter how talented a person is, he must suppress his realm to the peak of the unity stage. This was a very common requirement in the universe. The victor made a request to the loser. Ford was already mentally prepared for this, so he agreed. Okay, no problem. It was extremely difficult to advance to the tribulation transcendent stage. It was only 1,000 years, and it would pass in the blink of an eye. It wouldn't delay a few geniuses. Hearing this, Chun Chongqing continued. Fourth, as the defeated party, the demon race has to compensate the Deus cluster, the celestial cluster, and the silver ring with a total of 20 billion first-grade star stones. We will distribute the compensation to each party according to their losses and use it to rebuild their homes. 20 billion first-grade star stones sounded like a lot, but it was only the financial resources of an entire star cluster. Although it would be a little painful, it wasn't like they couldn't afford it. There's no problem with that either. It was common for the losing side to pay compensation to the winning side. Ford was also mentally prepared, so he readily agreed. Hearing this, Chun Chongqing couldn't help but smile. He had made the right choice to have the Demon King apologize and repent first. Once the demon race agreed to this most stringent request, breaking through the demon race's bottom line, the rest of the requests would no longer be a problem. In the following time, Chun Chongqing successively made 12 requests to Ford. Most of these requests were happily agreed to by Ford, and only a few of them were debated. Overall, the process of the peace talks was quite smooth. Okay, these are all the requests of the Endless Alliance Army. These requests have been clearly written in the Armistice Agreement. As long as both parties sign and swear to the heavens, the war will be over. Chun Chongqing looked at Ford with a smile. The peace talks were over, and his mission was successfully completed. Ford looked at Chun Chongqing and asked, I'm very curious, what kind of terms will you use to negotiate with Zerg? Chun Chongqing smiled and said, Zerg's situation is different from yours. They will most likely not agree to the peace talks, so we will turn our attention to Zerg and attack Zerg. Hearing Chun Chongqing's words, Ford only needed to think for a moment before he understood the key. The reason why the demon race took the initiative to start the war this time was because they were instigated by the Void Empire. This was the first time the demon race had cooperated with the Void Empire. Before this, Zerg had cooperated with the Void Empire many times and had an extremely close relationship. Now that the Void Empire's expeditionary army had been destroyed, Zerg would definitely receive the news and send this news back to the Void Empire. In the face of such a tragic loss, the Void Empire would definitely not let it go. At that time, the Void Empire's army might descend on the Holy Cluster again and start the war again. However, all of this had nothing to do with the demon race anymore. However, Ford's thoughts were actually somewhat different from what Qin Chongqing wanted to express. Since ancient times, Zerg have been enemies with humans and shifters. In the land of exile, the humans and shifters have been attacked by Zerg and hated Zerg to the bone. Even without this war, the humans and shifters would never coexist peacefully with Zerg. In the following war, the Endless Allied Army might not continue to participate, but the humans and shifters would never give up this opportunity to defeat Zerg. Although the Zergs were much weaker than Zerg in terms of the strength of the humans and shifters, they firmly believed that they could defeat Zerg under the leadership of Qin. Not to mention, they also had the strong support of the Tian people, their strategic partner. Before the Void Empire descended again, they must first solve the internal problem of Zerg. After sending Ford away, Qin, who had been staying in the cabin, returned to the deck. He looked at Qin Chongqing and asked, "How do you feel?" Qin Chongqing looked at Qin, smiled, and said, "To be honest, I was actually a little scared at first, but later I wasn't so scared anymore. Because I know that although I'm not strong enough, I have a strong background." Hearing Qin Chongqing's words, Qin chuckled and said, "You've always been strong, but you were too lazy in the past." Qin Chongqing laughed and said, "Now I'm going to make a comeback." Qin patted Qin Chongqing's shoulder and said, "Now that the matter of the demons and the Void Empire has been temporarily resolved, the only thing left is Zerg. Although we know that Zerg won't agree to negotiate with us, we still have to show our attitude. You contact Zerg in the name of the Endless Allied Army and negotiate with Zerg with the same terms as the demons. If they're willing, forget it, they definitely won't be willing." Qin knew Zerg well. He believed that Zerg would never agree to such harsh terms, because unlike the demons, Zerg had more confidence. Chapter 1360. The news that the Endless Allied Army had reached a truce with an Nephilim race had not yet spread, but Zerg had found out about it through special channels. Saint Emperor, the Nephilim race, and the Endless Allied Army have reached a truce. What do you think of this? Grissom looked at the Saint Emperor with a complicated gaze. After a period of rest, Grissom had basically walked out of the shadow of the battle in the Iki Nebula. However, the destruction of the Void Empire's expeditionary army and the peace talks between the Nephilim race and the Endless Allied Army had cast a shadow over her heart again. Now, in the demon faction, the Void Empire's expeditionary army had been completely wiped out. The Nephilim race had already bowed their heads to the Endless Allied Army. Only Zerg was left. If Zerg also chose to bow their heads to the Endless Allied Army, the war might end immediately. However, with Grissom's understanding of the Saint Emperor would not bow his head to the Endless Allied Army. Faced with Grissom's question, the Saint Emperor was silent for a moment before asking, "Do you think we should follow the Nephilim race and seek peace with the Endless Allied Army?" Hearing the Saint Emperor's question, Grissom pondered for a moment before replying, "I think, from the current situation, we should negotiate with the Endless Allied Army." Now that the Endless Allied Army had the upper hand, forcefully starting a war with the Endless Allied Army was not a good choice. The Saint Emperor raised his hand and lightly waved at Grissom. A piece of paper filled with words flew towards Grissom. He said to Grissom, "This is the agreement between the Nephilim race and the Endless Allied Army. Take a look." Grissom heard this and subconsciously reached out to take the paper. When she saw the contents of the paper, She could not help but reveal a look of shock. She cried out involuntarily. The Nephilim race actually agreed to so many harsh conditions? They even agreed to let the Nephilim king publicly apologize and repent for his crimes? Grissom could not believe it. If the Nephilim race had not lost their minds, why would they agree to such tyrannical conditions? The Saint Emperor looked at Grissom calmly and said, "This is the price for seeking peace." Grissom heard this and looked up at the Saint Emperor. Her expression was extremely complicated. She knew very well that with the Saint Emperor's temperament, he would definitely not agree to the terms of publicly apologizing and repenting for his crimes. In other words, there was nothing to discuss between them and the endless allied army. Therefore, this battle is unavoidable. Grey Castle sighed helplessly. She seemed to have foreseen the scene of blood flowing like a river in the Holy Cluster. These terms were sent to me by the endless allied army. They conveyed their intention to negotiate with us, but I refused. The Sage Emperor had played down this matter as if it were a trivial matter. When he made this decision, the Sage Emperor had not discussed it with anyone, nor had he told anyone about it. As the person closest to the Sage Emperor, Hui Qian had also just learned of this result. Although Hui Qian had expected that the Saint Emperor would not agree to such a condition, she could not help but feel disappointed when she heard the Saint Emperor say this himself. The Demon King could sacrifice himself for the great demonic star cluster, but the Saint Emperor, the war will come soon. Before that, I plan to help you become a demigod. Just as Hui Chong was letting his imagination run wild, the Saint Emperor's words shocked Hui Chong. You want to help me become a demigod? Hui Chong looked at the Saint Emperor and said, I'm afraid this will be very difficult, right? Although a demigod was only a demigod, it was not easy to become a demigod from the tribulation stage. The Saint Emperor looked at Hui Chong and said indifferently, the power of law you control is called the law of withering. It can cause all things in the world to wither and decay. It is a very unique power of law. I have never heard of anyone else controlling this law other than you. So it will not be difficult for me to help you become a demigod. Once you become a demigod, you will not be far from becoming a supreme existence. Hearing the Saint Emperor's words, Hui Chong's eyes suddenly shone brightly. Becoming a demigod, or even a supreme existence, had been her dream all this time. Was it finally going to come true? Deus Cluster. Qin Changxing took Zerg's reply and found Qin Chuan, who was cultivating. He looked at Qin Chuan, who was trying to derive demigod power from the law of space, and couldn't help but sigh. Qin Chuan's strength was now one of the top in the entire universe, but Qin Chuan had never slacked off for a moment. He had always been working hard on his cultivation. Compared to Qin Chuan's focus, he was far inferior. Boss, I brought Zerg's reply. They really did refuse to negotiate. Qin Changxing placed Zerg's reply in front of Qin Chuan, then sat down cross-legged in front of Qin Chuan. Qin Chuan slowly stopped cultivating, then glanced at the reply, then raised his head and looked at Qin Changxing. Tell the Nephilim to act according to the terms as soon as possible. After the Nephilim king publicly apologizes, we will move to the celestial cluster's rubble star and prepare to attack the holy cluster. Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Qin Changxing asked curiously, Boss, is the Saint Emperor a supreme existence? In the past, Qin Changxing didn't think there was anything wrong with a holy king suddenly calling himself the Saint Emperor. However, after knowing some of the symbols, he understood that the title Emperor could only be used on supreme existences. In other words, the Saint Emperor was very likely to have become a supreme existence. However, no one had seen the Saint Emperor in action. Qin Chuan pondered for a moment, and then he said, the Elysian Emperor has changed his title for a long time. If there really was a problem with him, it would have been discovered long ago. Since the Elysian Emperor has the confidence to refuse the peace talks, I think that he has probably become a supreme existence. Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Qin Changxing suddenly had a headache. He grinned and said, in that case, Zerg has the Saint Emperor and the Insectoid Queen, two supreme existences. This strength is comparable to the humans and shifters of the ancient times. No, you're wrong. Qin Shuan looked deeply at Chen Chongqing and said, "There's something wrong with Zerg." Chen Chongqing was stunned. He asked in confusion, "What's wrong with Zerg?" Qin Shuan pursed his lips and said, "If Zerg really has the Saint Emperor and the Insectoid Queen, do you think their current behavior is normal? If you were the Saint Emperor, would you have chosen to retreat when you were on Rebel Star?" Chen Chongqing subconsciously said, "If I were a supreme existence, the Saint Emperor, I would have killed the Tian People's Army in the Iki Nebula. If heaven appeared, I would have called the Insectoid Queen and fought 2 against 1. Chapter 1361. When Chen Chongqing subconsciously said those words, the expression on his face suddenly became somewhat subtle. At that time, he didn't feel that there was anything wrong with the Holy Emperor retreating, but now it seemed that there was a big problem. "Boss, you mean that Zerg has 2 ultimate existences, but there's a problem with one of them?" Chen Chongqing looked at Qin Shuan and said, "The Holy Emperor has appeared many times, which means that there's a problem with the Zerg Queen." Qin Shuan shook his head and said, "No, there shouldn't be a problem with the Zerg Queen. If there's a problem with the Zerg Queen, the law of desire will be open to everyone, just like when the ancestral dragon fell, and everyone could comprehend the law of space. However, until now, there hasn't been anyone who has comprehended the law of desire in the universe, which means that there's no problem with the Zerg Queen." Hearing Qin Shuan's words, Chen Chongqing was somewhat puzzled and said, "Is the Holy Emperor the problem?" Qin Shuan shook his head again and said, "To be honest, I don't know what's going on either. If Zerg really had 2 ultimate existences, then Zerg's performance should be even more domineering and powerful. Facing enemies, he should just directly sweep through them. However, Zerg didn't do that, which meant that there must be a problem within Zerg. As for what the problem was, Qin Shuan still needed time to investigate. However, this didn't stop them from using troops against Zerg. The war still had to continue. Universe Calendar, Year 14. 61 million December. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Demon Race officially announced to the entire universe in the name of the Demon King that on December 15th, the Demon King would use a live broadcast to apologize to the people of the universe who were affected by the flames of war and sincerely repent for the crimes he had committed in the past. As soon as this news was released, it shook the entire universe. Many people who were paying attention to this war knew that the endless allied army had the upper hand and that the demon race's defeat was a matter of time. However, these people didn't expect that the Demon King would actually use a live broadcast to apologize and repent after the demon race's defeat. One had to know that the Demon King was the king of the great demonic star cluster, the ruler of the demon race. To make such a high and mighty powerhouse publicly apologize and repent was something that had never happened before. And now, the endless allied army had created a precedent. Chen Chongqing was the representative of the endless allied army, and as the negotiator, he was famous and on fire. "Boss, I'm on fire." Chen Chongqing held his optical computer and looked at the discussions of the netizens on the internet. He was extremely excited. Qin Shuan looked at Chen Chongqing's excited expression and smiled. "What are you so excited about?" "Everyone gave me many titles, such as Demon Punisher, War Terminator, Embodiment of Justice, and so on. There are too many titles, and I like all of them. Boss, which one do you think suits my temperament the most?" Looking at Chen Chongqing's smiling face, Qin Shuan didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He asked, "It's just some titles. Do you have to be so excited?" The netizens are forgetful. It won't be long before they forget your great achievements, and when you accidentally make a mistake, all your past achievements will be overturned. They will nail you to the pillar of shame for the rest of your life. So, you don't have to care too much about what the netizens think of you. They are too fickle. Hearing Qin Shuan's words, Chen Chongqing was slightly stunned, and then asked Qin Shuan, "Boss, are you trying to hint at something?" Qin Shuan nodded gently and said, "In the upcoming war against the Holy Cluster, we may not be able to gain any advantage. When the time comes, the flames of war may spread beyond our control to some areas. At that time, the people who praise you now may ruthlessly throw you to the ground. The endless allied armies' battle against Zerg was imperative, but Qin was not sure whether they could win. Moreover, not everyone in the endless allied army was willing to continue participating in the upcoming war. They had to be mentally prepared. Chen Changxing grinned and said, "Boss, don't worry. I don't care what the netizens think of me. When the time comes, if someone scolds me, I will push all the responsibility to you." Qin looked at Chen Changxing helplessly and said, "That's good. I'm afraid that you will take all the responsibility and push all my responsibilities to yourself." The battle against Zerg was actively promoted by Qin, and it was also what he wanted to fight. When the time comes, if there were any problems, he should take responsibility and solve them. He didn't want to implicate the people around him. The power of public opinion might not have any influence on a supreme existence like him, but Chen Changxing was only in the middle stage of the Dongxi realm. There were some things that he should try not to take responsibility for. December 15th, Great Devil Star Cluster, 9 a.m. At this moment, in the entire universe, almost half of the people were sitting in front of their crystal screens. Even those who were working would secretly turn on their optical computers and watch the live broadcast on the internet. In the Great Devil Star Cluster, all the demons had sorrowful expressions. They knew that the reason the Demon King agreed to the endless allied army's request and publicly broadcast his apology and repentance was for the sake of the big picture and the future of the demon race. As demons and citizens of the Great Devil Star Cluster, they felt extremely sad for the Demon King's sacrifice. Qin and the others were also waiting in front of their crystal screens, patiently waiting for the live broadcast to begin. Suddenly, a tall figure appeared on the crystal screen. He was wearing a black robe, his face was pale, his eyes were scarlet, and his expression was cold. It was the appearance of the Demon King that everyone was familiar with. "Hello, everyone watching the live broadcast. I am the ruler of the Great Devil Star Cluster, Demon King Fox." Hearing Demon King Fox's words, Qin knew that the Demon King's name was Fox. In the past few years, many things have happened under the instigation of the Void Empire. My ambition grew rapidly, and I planned this invasion, causing countless innocent people to be affected by the flames of war, losing their homes and loved ones. This is the fault of the demon faction, the demon race, and my fault. Here, I would like to apologize to all the ordinary people affected by the flames of war, all the victims, and all the family members of the victims. I am very sorry. Because of my mistake, there are indelible scars in your lives. I am truly very sorry. At the same time, I would like to repent. I would like to repent to those who are watching the live broadcast and those who are not. In the past, I have committed crimes that are almost unforgivable. I have harmed many people and committed many heinous deeds. This is my sin, and in order to atone for it, I am willing to bear any consequences. Chapter 1362. This public broadcast lasted for 42 minutes. In these 42 minutes, Demon King Fox publicly apologized and repented for his sins according to the terms of the contract. His performance in the broadcast could only be described as sincere. At the very least, Qin could not find any fault with Demon King Fox's performance. Regardless of whether Demon King Fox was being serious or just acting, at least he had given everyone an explanation. After the broadcast ended, the entire universe's populace was discussing this matter. As ordinary people, the lowest level of the universe's populace, this was the first time they had seen such a high and mighty figure like Demon King Fox. Even if it was just in a live broadcast, it was still their first time. Furthermore, Demon King Fox had actually apologized to them. Such a fresh and strange experience made everyone want to express their feelings and emotions on the internet. Many people even publicly expressed their understanding of Demon King Fox. In the eyes of a small portion of the populace, being able to make Demon King Fox bow his head and apologize to them was enough to make up for the losses and injuries they had suffered. As for anything else, they didn't have much hope for it. These people were ordinary, pure, and kind. Often, they were the easiest to bewitch, deceive, and hurt. They were very cute, but also very pitiful. Just as the populace was discussing Demon King Fox's apology, Qin Chuan had already returned to the Endless Allied Army's logistics base and held a meeting with the higher-ups of the Endless Allied Army. Before the meeting began, everyone who entered the meeting room had a joyful smile on their faces. Although they had experienced many hardships in the past, now that the demon race had been defeated and Demon King Fox had bowed his head and admitted his mistakes, they had received compensation from the demon race. The war had also ended as they had wished. Their bodies and minds had been greatly satisfied. All of this made them feel very happy. When Qin Chuan walked into the meeting room, he saw everyone gathered together and enthusiastically discussing their thoughts on the broadcast. Everyone noticed Qin Chuan's arrival and immediately greeted Qin Chuan with smiles on their faces. Marshal Qin. Hello, Marshal Qin. Thank you for your hard work, Marshal Qin. Qin Chuan smiled and nodded at everyone, then slowly walked to the main seat at the table and sat down. When everyone saw Qin Chuan take a seat, they all returned to their seats. The lively meeting room almost instantly quieted down. Facing everyone's gazes, Qin Chuan pursed his lips and said to everyone, "Everyone must have watched the broadcast and already know about the Demon King Fox's apology." Hearing Qin Chuan's words, everyone immediately began discussing. The quiet for a moment, in the blink of an eye, it became extremely lively. Dong, dong, dong. Qin Chuan lightly knocked on the table, indicating for everyone to quiet down. After the conference room quieted down again, Qin Chuan said to everyone, "This is the greatest victory we've achieved since the establishment of our Endless Allied Army. However, this is only a temporary victory." After hearing Qin Chuan's words, the smiles on everyone's faces froze. A temporary victory? Facing everyone's puzzled eyes, Qin Chuan was silent for a moment, then said, "After we finished negotiating with the Nephilim, we sent the same terms to Zerg, but Zerg refused to negotiate. There was no room for negotiation." Hearing Qin Chuan's words, everyone's expression became a little subtle. If Qin Chuan had not mentioned it, they would have almost forgotten that in addition to the Void Empire and the Nephilim, there was also Zerg in the demon faction. Zerg refused to negotiate. This meant that the war was not over yet. Their enemy was still there. When they thought of this, there was no smile on everyone's face. Everyone's expression was extremely serious. "Everyone, the war is not over yet. Before we defeat Zerg and make Zerg sign the armistice agreement, we can't relax." Qin Chuan looked around and saw the expression on everyone's face. He saw irritation, uneasiness, helplessness, and disgust. Looking at everyone's different reactions and expressions, Qin Chuan knew that perhaps the cooperation with the Endless Allied Army had come to an end. Next, they would have to face Zerg alone. Now that the demon faction has completely collapsed and disbanded, we have actually won a great victory. Among the crowd, someone whispered his opinion. In his opinion, after winning a great victory, there was no need to pursue the losing side. Being able to set an example like the Nephilim was enough to intimidate Zerg. Zerg suffered heavy losses in the Battle of Beloved Nebula and has retreated to the Holy Cluster. They are no longer able to fight outside. In my opinion, we should let Zerg go for the time being. If Zerg starts a war again one day, it won't be too late for us to send troops to deal with Zerg. Yes, I think so too. This has been going on for so many years. Everyone is tired and wants to rest. The land of Silver Ring needs to be rebuilt. We really don't have the energy to continue fighting outside. After the first person spoke, everyone started talking. In short, almost everyone did not want to continue this war. They were tired of war and began to yearn for a peaceful and stable life. If you let Zerg go now, don't regret it when Zerg comes back after he recovers. Tian San snorted and said, "When the time comes, if Zerg wants to target the land of Silver Ring, we Tian people may not stop him." When everyone heard Tian San's words, their faces revealed a trace of displeasure. Tian San's words were clearly a threat to them. However, they could understand Tian San. After all, the Holy Cluster and the Celestial Cluster bordered. If they did not defeat Zerg now, When Zerg came back, the first to bear the brunt of his attack would be the Celestial Cluster. Just like when the Nephilim attacked the Deus Cluster, before the Deus Cluster fell, the Celestial Cluster would not be affected by the war. However, if the Tian people were willing to make way for Zerg, then Zerg would be more than happy to attack the land of Silver Ring. Just when everyone was about to refute Tian San, Qin Xuan tapped the table again and said to everyone, "Everyone quiet down. Now listen to me." After everyone quieted down, Qin Xuan said indifferently, "Let's decide by voting whether to continue this war or to disband the endless allied army. It's up to you." Chapter 1363. When everyone heard Qin Xuan's words, they couldn't help but look at each other. If they really voted according to Qin Xuan's words, then with the number of people in the Silver Ring, they would definitely have the upper hand. Or was this just Qin Xuan's way of eliminating dissidents? Just when everyone was hesitating, Qin Xuan said, "I know what you are worried about. A forcibly picked melon is not sweet. If you don't want to continue fighting, I can forcibly kidnap you to the front line. You won't actively fight either. Since that's the case, it's better for everyone to part on good terms." At this point, Qin Xuan paused for a moment and then continued, "No matter what the final result of the vote is, I will respect everyone's choice, and I will never do anything to hurt anyone." Hearing Qin Xuan's words, everyone finally dispelled their worries and chose to believe in Qin Xuan. After the vote, they could go home. Now, those who are willing to continue fighting, please raise your hand. As the commander-in-chief, Qin Xuan didn't raise his hand, but after his voice fell, Chun Chongqing, representing the human race, raised his hand. As a member of the demon faction, the insectoids must pay the price they deserve. I support the continuation of this war to completely crush the insectoids and the demon faction. At the same time, Yao Rao raised her hand and said indifferently, "My thoughts are the same as Chun Chongqing's." Then, Pope Saint Baudelo slowly raised his hand and said, "The recovery of the Deus Cluster depends on everyone's strength. So before everyone's threat is removed, the Deus Cluster will not withdraw from this war, and the One God religion will not withdraw from this war." Tian San raised his hand and said, "On behalf of the Tian people, I declare that before Zerg signs the Armistice Agreement, the war will absolutely not stop." Following Tian San's declaration, a few other powers from the Silver Ring land who were close to the Tian clan also expressed their willingness to continue this war. As for the rest of the people, they remained silent, not saying a word. Based on the number of people present, the majority of the people who did not raise their hands were from the Silver Ring. Qin Xuan was neither surprised nor angry when he saw this, because he had already expected this situation before the start of the meeting. At this moment, there was only calmness in his heart. Those who did not raise their hands turned their gazes in other directions. They did not dare to look at Qin Xuan, nor did they want to look at those who raised their hands. They were afraid that Qin Xuan would fly into a rage out of humiliation and break his promise to punish them. It seems that most people are unwilling to continue the war. Qin Xuan spoke slowly. His tone was very calm and composed. He was not as angry as everyone had imagined. "In that case, let's go our separate ways. You go your own way, and we go our own way." Qin Xuan pursed his lips slightly and said, "From now on, there will be no more endless alliance army in this world." When everyone heard Qin Xuan's last sentence, their expressions became extraordinarily complicated. It had been 3 or 4 years since the establishment of the Endless Alliance Army. Although this amount of time was nothing for practitioners, everything they had experienced during these years was precious. If there was no Endless Alliance Army, and if Qin Xuan had not stood up for them again and again, perhaps the universe would have become a place where the demon faction could dominate and wreak havoc. It was not an exaggeration to say that the contribution made by all of them in the Endless Alliance Army was not even comparable to the contribution made by Qin Xuan alone. Therefore, when they heard Qin Xuan say in a calm tone that he wanted to disband the Endless Alliance Army, their mood was somewhat difficult to accept. Even those who did not raise their hands were the same. Qin Chuan took out the agreement that he had prepared beforehand and placed it on the table. Then he said to everyone, "I have an agreement here. You can take a look. If you don't have any objections, then sign this agreement. Then you can take the compensation that the demon race has given you and your soldiers to return to their homes." Everyone was stunned when they heard Qin Chuan's words. They did not expect that Qin Chuan would have an agreement in his hand. They could only leave after signing the agreement. At this time, Lu Zi, who was sitting next to Qin Chuan, had already distributed the agreement to everyone. After reading the content of the agreement, the expression on everyone's face became extremely strange. The content of the agreement was not complicated, and it was even a little simple. Anyone who signed the agreement could leave the Endless Alliance army with everything they deserved and return to their home. At the same time, the Tian people and the Protoss would not cut off trade with them, and they would not block the Silver Ring land. These were the contents of the agreement. Simply put, even if they left, they would not be punished. They had chosen to leave, but Qin Chuan didn't push things too far. He didn't treat them as outsiders. Such magnanimity caused everyone to feel incomparably ashamed. In the face of Qin Chuan's kindness, everyone was a little hesitant. They did not know whether to sign the agreement and leave, or to stay in the Endless Alliance army and continue to fight with Zerg. "I want to go back and rebuild my home. Sorry." At this time, someone stood up, pushed the agreement in his hand forward, turned around, and left. In the signature area of the agreement, he had already signed his name. With the first person taking the lead, the second person quickly signed the agreement. "I don't want to continue to participate in the war after this. I want to live a stable life." "Sorry." "Me too. I want to go home and spend more time with my wife and family." "I'm really sorry. In the future, if fate wills it, we'll meet again." As more and more people signed the agreement and left, the conference room gradually became empty. Qin Chuan sat in the main seat, expressionless. Most of the other people who chose to stay and fight side by side were the same. They had tried their best to persuade these people to stay, but these people chose to leave in the end. After all the people who chose to leave had signed the agreement and left, there were only a few dozen figures left in the conference room. In the Silver Ring land, only the Fire Spirit race, the Desolate race, and the Metal race chose to stay. They're all gone. Tianxin turned his head to look at Qin Chuan and sighed. Qin Chuan pursed his lips and said, "Many people left, but those who stayed are like-minded people. Our strength seems to have weakened, but in fact, it has become stronger." "What you said makes sense." Tianxin asked, "What should we do next?" Qin Chuan took a deep breath and said, "Let's go to the Celestial Cluster, Rocky Star, and prepare for war." Chapter 1364. The official announcement of the disbandment of the Endless Allied Army appeared in front of everyone in a very sudden manner. No one expected that the Endless Allied Army would disband the day after the Nephilim admitted defeat and apologized. And the reason for the disbandment of the Endless Allied Army was also spread to the outside world by insiders. It turned out that the upper echelons of the Endless Allied Army were divided into two factions. One faction advocated for a ceasefire, and everyone went back to rebuild their homes, while the other faction insisted on continuing the war and wanted to stop only after the last force of the Demon Alliance, Zerg, was completely defeated. Regarding the debate between these two factions, some people supported the side that advocated a ceasefire, while others supported the side that advocated continuing the war. The reasons given by both sides were very legitimate and irrefutable. 3 years was not a long time for a practitioner. Some practitioners could spend 3 years in seclusion just for a short period of time, while some practitioners with profound realms could even spend hundreds or thousands of years in seclusion. But war was different. A war that lasted for 3 years was a great consumption of manpower and material resources. There were people sacrificing on the battlefield every moment. The number of people who died in this 3-year war was tens of thousands of times more than the number of people who died naturally in the universe during peacetime. If it were not for Qin Chuan, perhaps the number would be even greater and more shocking. Therefore, in a situation where they could choose to stop the war, very few people were willing to continue the war. Therefore, many people could understand the thinking of those who advocated a ceasefire. They were just tired and wanted to take a rest. It was not unforgivable. On the other hand, those who supported continuing the war had a different view. This war not only consumed the manpower and material resources of the endless Allied army, but also the manpower and material resources of the Demon Alliance. In the situation where the Void Empire Expeditionary Army was completely destroyed and the Nephilim admitted defeat, Zerg was already unable to save the situation alone. The endless Allied army should pursue the victory and defeat Zerg to completely end the war, instead of giving Zerg a chance to catch his breath and give Zerg a chance to make a comeback. If Zerg started the war again, the ones who would suffer would still be ordinary people like them. Therefore, it was best to nip all threats in the bud now. And most of those who had this idea were residents of the Celestial Cluster, because the Holy Cluster and the Celestial Cluster bordered. If Zerg started the war again, the first to bear the brunt would be the Tion people. Of course, they supported the endless Allied army to completely defeat Zerg. Moreover, what angered them the most was that most of those who advocated a ceasefire were from the Silver Ring. If the Holy Cluster bordered the Silver Ring, they really wanted to see what kind of these people's faces. The discussions on the internet were overwhelming, but Qin Xuan didn't care about them at all. At this time, Qin Xuan and the others had already embarked on the road to the Celestial Cluster. The endless Allied army, which used to be as high as 6 billion, was now reduced to less than 5 billion. Now, the Deus Cluster did not have any extra troops, and the Tion people could mobilize at most 1 billion troops. In other words, their total military strength could reach 5 billion, which should be enough to deal with Zerg alone. And the new Alliance army was called the Army of Justice. If we want to gain the support of the people and guide the power of public opinion, then we must have a good name, occupy the moral high ground, and be righteous. This was Chen Chongqing's idea. Similarly, the name Army of Justice was also Chen Chongqing's idea. Qin Xuan looked at Chen Chongqing and said to him, "Chongqing, I'm going to let you command this battle." Chen Chongqing was shocked when he heard this. He said, "Boss, I can't do it. I'm too weak. I can't suppress those people." Although those who stayed behind were his companions and friends, Chen Chongqing knew in his heart that these people had stayed behind because of Qin Xuan. He simply did not have that kind of charisma. Qin Xuan smiled and said to Chen Chongqing, "I'm still the commander-in-chief. However, the commander-in-chief of the battlefield is you. When you give orders, you can use my name." After hearing Qin Xuan's explanation, Chen Chongqing breathed a sigh of relief. Then he asked with some doubts, "Boss, you're giving me the task of command. What about you?" Qin Xuan said to Chen Chongqing, "I have other things to do." Chen Chongqing looked at Qin Xuan with a subtle gaze and said, "Boss, hearing you say this, I have a feeling that you're going to do something very dangerous. Don't think too much. I'll always be by your side. We'll fight side by side." Qin Xuan patted Chen Chongqing on the shoulder and said, "Your ability to command in battle has been verified. Everyone recognizes you. You're the most suitable person to command this battle." "Boss, since you've already said so, if I still refuse, it would seem a little pretentious." Chen Chongqing grinned at Qin Xuan and said, "Boss, I will definitely not disappoint you." Qin Xuan smiled and nodded. "I'll always believe in you." Holy Cluster, Sage Monarch Continent. The Saint Emperor sat on a high platform, looking down at Hui Qian with a subtle gaze. "How do you feel?" he asked. Hui Qian slowly raised his head and looked at the Saint Emperor. In a low voice, he said, "I feel like I can still get stronger." The Saint Emperor nodded. "It's good that you feel that way. I felt the same way back then. Then, I really did get stronger." Hui Qian was about to say something when her expression suddenly changed. She opened her mouth and retched. In the next moment, a large number of milky white, thumb-sized insects spat out of her mouth and scattered on the clean floor. They wriggled and crawled, looking extremely disgusting. Cough, cough. Cough, cough. Hui Qian coughed nonstop, occasionally spitting out 1 or 2 more insects. Looking at the insects on the floor, she couldn't help but looked pained. The Saint Emperor looked at the scene calmly and said, "Eat them. Otherwise, she won't be happy." Hearing the Saint Emperor's words, Hui Qian seemed to have thought of something extremely terrifying. Her expression suddenly turned ugly. At the same time, she slowly reached out with her slightly trembling hand and grabbed the worms that were wriggling and crawling on the floor. She actually stuffed them back in her mouth. After the insects entered her mouth, they strangely turned into a milky white stream of energy that flowed into Hui Qian's stomach. As Hui Qian swallowed more and more insects, her aura grew stronger and stronger. She had actually surpassed the boundary of a demigod. Chapter 1365. In the Void Empire. In the gloomy hall, Zadier sat on the high platform of the hall. Beneath him was a throne made of pure dark void crystal. This throne originally belonged to Zadier and Kassisna, but now it belonged to Zadier alone. Today was Zadier's first day out of closed-door cultivation, and on this day, he heard very bad news. The 6 billion troops of the Void Empire Expeditionary Army had been completely wiped out. When the head of the intelligence agency, Maggie, reported this news to Zadier, she was already prepared to die. She had thought of many possible reactions from Zadier. Based on her understanding of Zadier, he would definitely kill to vent his anger. Zadier had a special characteristic when he was angry. He did not vent his emotions by roaring like ordinary people. Instead, he liked to sneer. The gloomier his smile, the angrier he would be. When he completely exploded, Zadier's methods would also be exceptionally cruel. On the way here, Maggie had thought about how she would die in Zadier's hands. Perhaps she would be torn into pieces or skinned alive. If Zadier was willing to kill her instantly, it could be said to be a great gift. Maggie knelt in the hall, silently waiting for Zadier's sneer to ring out. However, after waiting for a long time, she did not hear any sneer from Zadier. "I already know about the matter. You may leave." Just as Maggie was feeling apprehensive and doubtful, Zadier's voice suddenly rang in her ears. When she heard Zadier's words, Maggie could not help but be stunned on the spot. Leave? He was actually retreating? Maggie was very surprised and even a little shocked. She was already prepared to face death, but in the end, nothing happened. This situation made Maggie suspect that what she had reported was not bad news, but great news. Otherwise, with Zadier's character, how could he let her off so easily? "What? Do you still have some news that you haven't finished?" When she heard Zadier's words again, Maggie seemed to have woken up from a dream and quickly said, "No, I'll take my leave." As she spoke, Maggie stood up and slowly retreated to the back. While she was retreating, she was also waiting for Zadier's sudden attack. However, even after she exited the hall, the attack she imagined did not come. This caused Maggie, who had just survived a disaster, to be filled with curiosity and doubt. She even suspected that the person in the hall was not Zadie. However, what Maggie did not know was that the reason Dill did not kill her to vent his anger was that the sacrifice of the Expeditionary Army's 6 billion troops was not a big deal to him. It was not worth taking to heart, much less getting angry over. If it had been in the past, perhaps Zadier would have killed Maggie to vent his anger over such a huge loss. However, now that he had become a rank 1 magus, Zadier no longer cared about the lives of the soldiers at the bottom. As long as he was still alive, the Void Empire would never fall. A rank 1 magus. He lowered his head and looked at his hands. Wisps of blackish-purple void energy drifted out from his palms, emitting a frightening energy fluctuation. This is true divine power. It's a power that only gods can possess. Zadier looked at the divine power in his palms with infatuation. Compared to true divine power, the so-called demigod power was completely trash. Just as Zadier was immersed in his own world and could not extricate himself, a majestic aura slowly descended into the hall and woke him up. Zadier raised his eyes and looked forward. He saw a blurry figure standing in the air in the center of the hall. A pair of amber-like eyes were calmly looking at him. The blurry figure looked at Zadier and said indifferently, "It's time to do what you promised me." When Zadier heard this, An expectant smile slowly appeared on his face. He said to the blurry figure, "I can help you complete what I promised you, but before that, I want to try and see if I'm stronger or weaker than you." Hearing Zadier's words, the blurry figure fell silent. After a while, his amber-like eyes gradually turned dark red. They were like two blood-red vortexes that deeply attracted Zadier. Zadier faced the pair of dark red eyes and did not move. Instead, the expression on his face became extremely solemn and even a little dignified. After a while, Zadier's face suddenly turned pale, and a trace of blood flowed out from the corner of his mouth. When the blood flowed out from the corner of Zadier's mouth, the blurry figure slowly dissipated. Phew! Zadier exhaled softly. He glanced at the empty center of the hall and could not help but have an extremely complicated expression on his face. As expected, compared to this guy, I'm still far too weak. After lamenting, Zadier slowly stood up. Since he had already lost, he could only obediently follow the other party's request and go to the other side of the universe to bring Qin Xuan back. At the same time, it could be considered as revenge for the expeditionary army's nearly 10 billion soldiers. Holy Cluster, Sage Monarch Continent. The Sage Emperor stood on top of a tall mountain, looking up at the sky. He could vaguely sense that something was trying to break through the barrier between the two worlds and descend into this world. If he guessed correctly, this should be the work of the Void Empire. Behind the Sage Emperor, Huizhong stood motionless. Her eyes were slightly closed as if she was cultivating. Her aura was stirring, sometimes strong and sometimes weak. It was extremely strange. In a place where outsiders could not see, under the cover of Huizhong's clothes, there were thousands of small protrusions on her body. These protrusions did not have a regular shape, but most of them were elliptical. The strangest thing was that these protrusions were slowly moving. They were not static. Every time Huizhong's aura became stronger, more than half of these protrusions would disappear. Then, as Huizhong's aura weakened, the protrusions that disappeared would reappear. It was very special. Don't just blindly try to absorb and devour them. You have to learn to coexist with them. The Sage Emperor slowly turned around and looked at Huizhong, instructing her. Hearing the Sage Emperor's words, Huizhong slowly opened her eyes and looked at the Sage Emperor. She asked, "Did you experience this before?" The Sage Emperor nodded. This is something that must be experienced in order to obtain power. Hearing the Sage Emperor's answer, Huizhong's expression could not help but turn cold. When she first heard the Sage Emperor say that he had a way to help her become a demigod, or even a supreme existence, she was extremely excited. However, if she had known that things would turn out like this, she would rather not have ascended for the rest of her life than become such a monstrous existence. Chapter 1366. Iki Nebula. After a long journey of nearly 3 months, Qin Xuan and the rest finally arrived at the Iki Nebula. They planned to rest and reorganize in the Iki Nebula before setting off for Messy Rock Star. In the past 3 months, the Army of Justice had undergone a series of changes and adjustments. Their military strength had been expanded to 2 billion, and most of them were new recruits. The veterans who had participated in several wars had been sent back to Stansos. They could choose to continue fighting with the army, or they could choose to return home. Qin Xuan did not force them to do so. Although some people felt that Qin Xuan was too soft-hearted and would affect the overall strength of the army, Qin Xuan still did so. This was because Qin Xuan knew very well that in the coming war, these ordinary soldiers would not be of much use. The ones who could really influence the situation of the battlefield and decide the outcome of the war were the top combat forces above the tribulation stage. On the Army of Justice's side, other than Qin Xuan, there were also Lu Zi, Zhou Lin, Saint Baudelaire, Huang Feng, Sharmila, and Thelon. Chiron originally wanted to participate in this war, but at this time he was still presiding over the situation in the Silver Ring. At least, he could only return after the Silver Ring had settled down. It was worth mentioning that Huang Feng had just passed the immortal tribulation not long ago and became a supreme existence in the tribulation stage. On the other hand, Lu Zi and Zhou Lin had both controlled more than half of the power of laws in their respective law domains and had become demigods. Lu Zi and Zhou Lin had only been in the tribulation stage for about a year or so. No one expected them to become demigods so quickly. Qin Chuan believed that this was related to Lu Zi and Zhou Lin's uniqueness. Lu Zi controlled the law of illusion. In the universe, there were very few people who were proficient in illusions. People like Lu Zi, who was born with an illusion talent rune and inherited the Phantom Dragon, were even rarer. Therefore, it was normal that Lu Zi could easily become a demigod in the law of illusion. As for Zhou Lin, who was reborn with the help of the law of gold, she was a part of the law of gold. After controlling a part of the law of gold, she naturally became a demigod. Her promotion was even smoother than Lu Zi's. In the past 3 months, Qin Chuan had been deriving demigod power from the law of space, while deepening his control of the law of thunder. Now, he had also controlled more than half of the law of thunder and could derive demigod power from the law of thunder. However, Qin Chuan's situation was different from others. Other people's demigod power came from the same source, but Qin Chuan's demigod power came from the law of space and the law of thunder respectively. This made it difficult for Qin Chuan's demigod power to fuse together. When the two were added together, there was a strange situation where 1 + 1 was less than 2. When Qin Chuan tried to fuse the two demigod powers with the law of void, he found that the law of void seemed to have lost its previous neutralization. There was no way to fuse the two demigod powers together. After discovering this, Qin Chuan made various attempts and finally came to a conclusion. If he wanted to fuse the two demigod powers together, he would either have to control more power in the two law domains or derive demigod power from the law of void and then neutralize the other two demigod powers. The reason why the power of the void can't neutralize the two demigod powers is because the power of the void I control is too weak. I need to control more of the power of the void, but it's almost impossible for me to comprehend the law of the void. Qin Chuan frowned. The law of void used to belong to Su Ling, Kasisna, and Zadie. Now that Su Ling and Kasisna had fallen, Zadie was the only one in charge. Calculating the time, Zadie should have successfully advanced to rank 1. It was almost impossible for him to comprehend the law of void under such circumstances. So if I want to fuse the two demigod powers together, I have to control more power in the two law domains, the law of space and the law of thunder. The law of thunder is easy to deal with since Rengar's death freed up a lot of space, but the law of space is a bit more troublesome. Since the fall of the ancestral Gragon, too many people have comprehended the law of space. Even if I have the advantage of the true dragon bloodline, it's difficult to control more power. Qin Chuan had a better understanding of his own situation. Because of him and Rengar, the law of thunder was rarely controlled by others. Now that Rengar had fallen, at least 70% of the power had been freed up. Qin Chuan had controlled about 30% during this period, but he still felt that there was some power he could control. After some time, Qin Chuan felt that he would feel the existence of a bottleneck when he controlled more than 60% of the power in the law of thunder. As for the law of space, Qin Chuan felt that controlling 50% of it was already his limit. The other 50% was divided among tens of millions of people. If he wanted to seize the other 50%, he would have to kill people. However, killing people for no reason was not Qin Chuan's style. Moreover, even if Qin Chuan killed most of the people who also control the law of space, it would be difficult for him to gain much because there was still one person who controlled a lot of the law of space. That person was you. Back then, the reason why you attacked the ancestral Gragon was to seize the law of space. Qin Chuan remembered this very clearly. Therefore, ever since he started cultivating, Qin Chuan finally encountered a bottleneck on his cultivation path. If Qin Chuan wanted to break through this bottleneck, it would be very, very difficult. When he saw Lu Zi and Zhou Lin easily control more than 50% of the power in the law of illusion and law of gold respectively, and become demigods, Qin Chuan was very envious. He had once thought of giving up on the law of space and focusing on the law of thunder. That way, he could greatly increase his chances of becoming a supreme existence. However, if Qin Chuan really did that, he could easily become a supreme existence. But at the same time, he would also become an ordinary existence. Not to mention fighting against you. He might not even be able to defeat Zadie. Therefore, in order to become stronger, Qin Chuan had to walk a path without any experience to learn from. He could only rely on brute force to fight. As for whether he would succeed in fighting a bloody path or be badly battered in the end, it was up to fate. Chapter 1367. Universe Calendar, June 1462 million year. Qin Chuan convened the first high-level meeting of the Army of Justice since its establishment. There were not many people who were qualified to participate in this meeting. Other than the supreme existences of passing calamity stage, only the true high-level people could participate in this meeting. Qin Chuan sat on the main seat, looked at everyone in front of him, and said, "Now that our forces have been assembled, we can rush to Chaotic Stone Star at any time. But before that, I have several things to say." Facing the gaze of everyone, Qin Chuan indifferently said, "First, although I am the commander-in-chief, but I am not particularly good at commanding the battle, so I intend to appoint Chun Chongqing as the commander-in-chief of the front line. If anyone has any objection, you can raise it now." Hearing Qin Chuan's words, everyone subconsciously looked at Chun Chongqing, who was sitting upright and still. In the past few years, Chun Chongqing had already proved to everyone that he was a person with outstanding commanding ability. So they didn't have any objection to Chun Chongqing being the commander-in-chief of the front line. Seeing no one spoke, Qin Chuan continued. "Second, Yao Rao will still be in charge of intelligence." Yao Rao was the same as Chun Chongqing. She had been in charge of intelligence collection for the past few years and had done a very outstanding job. Regarding Qin Chuan's second appointment, everyone still didn't have any objection. After a moment, Qin Chuan continued. "Third, Elder Tian San will be in charge of logistics." Now that the army was located in Celestial Cluster, the mobilization of all kinds of materials had to go through the hands of Tian people. So Tian San being in charge of logistics was also a normal and reasonable matter. Fourth, when I'm not here, if you have any matter, you can discuss it. If you can't come to a conclusion, then Chun Chongqing will be in charge. Hearing Qin Chuan's fourth appointment, everyone was slightly surprised. It sounded like Qin Chuan was preparing to leave the army and act alone. "Marshal Qin, are you preparing to act alone?" Tian San looked at Qin Chuan and said, "Although the majority of people in Holy Cluster can't do anything to you, but if you let Sage Emperor know that you're going to Holy Cluster alone, perhaps you will be in danger." After going through successive wars, although the strength of Holy Cluster had been greatly weakened, but as long as Sage Emperor was present, these weakening was meaningless. With Qin Chuan's strength, admittedly, he could easily defeat or even kill crossing Realm Supreme Existence, and even Demigod, but facing Sage Emperor, who was rumored to be a Supreme Existence, Qin Chuan's chance of survival was almost zero. In the past, the Saint Emperor did not make a move against Qin Chuan, but this did not mean that the Saint Emperor would not make a move against Qin Chuan in the future. Moreover, with Sage Emperor's methods, it wasn't difficult for him to monitor the entire Holy Cluster. If Qin Chuan entered Holy Cluster alone and was discovered by Sage Emperor, there was an extremely high chance that Sage Emperor would take action. Tian San's words were very tactful. He hoped that Qin Chuan would sober up a little, maintain his rationality, and not do anything unwise. Everyone agreed with Tian San's words. They also didn't want Qin Chuan to act alone and didn't want anything to happen to Qin Chuan. In the face of everyone's concern, Qin Chuan faintly smiled and said, "Actually, everyone has fallen into a misconception." When everyone heard Qin Chuan's words, a trace of doubt appeared on their faces. Misconception? Was there? In the face of everyone's doubts, Qin Chuan smiled and explained, "The last time I faced Sage Emperor didn't take action because of Sky Emperor's existence. This time, The Celestial Emperor isn't here. So if the Sage Emperor wants to attack me, whether I'm with everyone or alone, he won't have any misgivings. If I'm with everyone, I might implicate everyone, so it's best for me to act alone. Everyone was stunned by Qin Chuan's explanation. According to Qin Chuan, if Sage Emperor really wanted to take action against Qin Chuan, then Qin Chuan would be in danger under any circumstances. This had nothing to do with Qin Chuan acting alone. What you said makes sense. Why don't we ask Sky Emperor to step in? Tian San pondered for a moment and still felt that Qin Chuan's words made more sense. If they wanted to restrain Sage Emperor, then they had to ask Sky Emperor to step in. Otherwise, once they started a war against the Holy Cluster, Sage Emperor could completely annihilate all of them without a supreme existence present. Hearing Tian San's words, Chen Changxing also said, "That's right. If Sky Emperor isn't present, then we can't attack the Holy Cluster." Qin Chuan shook his head and said, "Your thoughts aren't wrong, but your thoughts are based on the fact that Sky Emperor is also a supreme existence. But is Sky Emperor really a supreme existence?" When everyone heard Qin Chuan's words, they were extremely shocked. If Sky Emperor isn't a supreme existence, then why did he dare to be captured alive? Lu Zi frowned and said, "Sky Emperor should also be a supreme existence." Qin Chuan turned to look at Lu Zi and said, "Have you seen Sky Emperor take action with your own eyes, or heard Sky Emperor admit that he is a supreme existence with your own ears?" Qin Chuan's question stumped Lu Zi. She subconsciously turned to look at Tian San, hoping that Tian San could give a more reasonable explanation. However, when faced with Lu Zi's gaze, Tian San frowned and his expression turned ugly. When everyone saw the change in Tian San's expression, their hearts trembled slightly. Could it be that Sky Emperor really wasn't a supreme existence? But if Sky Emperor wasn't a supreme existence, then why did he have the courage to be captured alive? Could it be that Sky Emperor was gambling with his own life? A series of questions appeared in everyone's minds, and no one knew what the correct answer was. Seeing that everyone was silent, Qin Chuan pursed his lips and said, "So, we can't pin our hopes on something that we can't determine is true or false. At the same time, no one has seen Sage Emperor take action, so Sage Emperor might not be a supreme existence." Qin Chuan's words shocked everyone once again. Sage Emperor had never taken action, nor had he personally admitted that he had ascended to a supreme existence. Just based on a change in title, it was impossible to determine that Sage Emperor had ascended to a supreme existence. Zhou Lin looked deeply at Qin Chuan and said, "So, you want to use yourself as bait to test whether Sage Emperor has ascended to a supreme existence, right?" When everyone heard Zhou Lin's words, they all looked at Qin Chuan. If what Zhou Lin said was true, then Qin Chuan was a little too daring. This was completely gambling with his life. Qin Chuan was silent for a moment in the face of everyone's gazes, and then he replied, "This matter must be confirmed." Chapter 1368. Hearing Qin Chuan admit to this idea, everyone's expression suddenly became serious. "I don't agree." Lu Zi looked at Qin Chuan and said in a low voice, "This is too dangerous." In Lu Zi's opinion, risking one's life in order to test what level the Holy Emperor was completely ridiculous. Qin Chuan heard this and replied, "I estimate that the Holy Emperor has most likely not ascended to the level of ultimate existence. Everything is just a bluff. This is just your estimation, not the truth. What if he really ascends to the level of ultimate existence?" Lu Zi frowned and said, "Have you ever thought that you will die?" Lu Zi is right, Qin Chuan. This is too dangerous. Sharmila also came to persuade Qin Chuan. She would rather temporarily give up the plan to attack the Holy Cluster than let Qin Chuan take this risk, because there was really no need for it. Qin Chuan looked at Sharmila and said, "If the Holy Emperor has already ascended to the level of ultimate existence, then during the battle in the Iki Nebula, he would not have stood by and watched Zerg suffer heavy losses." Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Sharmila shook her head and said, Qin Xuan, you don't understand that kind of high and mighty mentality. Ultimate existences do not care about things like casualties and losses. If they really cared about these things, then the one true God atheist would not have sat by and watched the demon faction wreak havoc in the Deus cluster. At this point, Sharmila turned to look at Saint Baudelaire and said, I'm not targeting the one God sect. I'm just telling the truth. Hearing Sharmila's words, Saint Baudelaire was not angry. On the contrary, he agreed with what Sharmila said because what Sharmila said was indeed the truth. When the Deus cluster was being ravaged by the Nephilim race, the one true God atheist did choose to stand by and watch. If the one true God atheist had chosen to take action at that time, although he might have provoked the Nephilim king, at least the Deus cluster would have been stabilized. However, the one true God atheist did not do so. In the eyes of the one true God atheist, as long as he, an ultimate existence, was still alive, the destruction of the one God sect and the Deus cluster was insignificant. This was because he could rebuild the one God sect at any time and regain a territory. These things might be difficult for others, but for an ultimate existence, it was a piece of cake. Therefore, although the Saint Emperor had not taken action from beginning to end, nor had he announced to the public that he had been promoted to an ultimate existence, it was very likely that the Saint Emperor had already been promoted to an ultimate existence from his high and mighty attitude of looking down on all living beings. Qin Xuan was gambling with his life, and the biggest possibility was that he would lose his life. Qin Xuan, think twice before you act. Tian Sen also joined in persuading Qin Xuan. Qin Xuan was the backbone of everyone and the soul of the army. No matter what, nothing could happen to him. If anything happened to Qin Xuan, it would not only affect Qin Xuan, the human race, and the demon race. It would affect the entire situation. In the face of everyone's persuasion, Qin Xuan could not help but fall silent. He could understand everyone's feelings and was very touched by their concern and concern. However, he could not give up on certain things just because of their concern and persuasion. After a moment of silence, Qin Xuan said, I appreciate everyone's kindness, but I've decided to act alone. Please believe me, even if the Saint Emperor has really been promoted to an ultimate existence, I'm still confident that I can escape from him. There were some things that Qin Xuan could not explain clearly to everyone. Hearing Qin Xuan's response, Lu Zi frowned and said, How confident are you? Unless you can prove it to us, we won't agree to it. Lu Zi is right. Zhou Lin looked at Qin Xuan and said, Qin Xuan, what trump cards do you have? If it's not convenient to reveal them, you can tell Lu Zi. As long as Lu Zi believes that you can escape from the Saint Emperor, we won't stop you. If there was someone that Qin Xuan trusted the most, then Lu Zi would definitely be at the top. If there was someone that was most worried about Qin Xuan's safety, then Lu Zi would still be at the top. Therefore, if Qin Xuan could persuade Lu Zi, then they would not have any objections. Everyone had the same attitude towards this. Qin Xuan looked around and finally fixed his eyes on Lu Zi. He transmitted a sentence to Lu Zi, and Lu Zi's expression changed slightly. When everyone saw the change in Lu Zi's expression, they could not help but be curious about what Qin Xuan had said to Lu Zi. However, they restrained their curiosity and did not ask. In the future, they would not ask either. Lu Zi had a complicated expression. After hesitating for a while, she said to Qin Xuan, You must be careful. When everyone heard Lu Zi's words, they understood that Qin Xuan had successfully persuaded Lu Zi. In other words, Lu Zi believed that Qin Xuan could escape from the Saint Emperor, who was suspected to be a supreme existence. After the meeting ended, Qin Xuan left the Eking Nebula by himself. When Qin Xuan left, no one went to see him off. It was not that they didn't want to go, but Qin Xuan didn't want them to. He wanted to make sure that his whereabouts were absolutely hidden. No one would be able to discover him. After Qin Xuan left, Chun Chongqing went to Lu Zi. He said to Lu Zi, I'm not trying to pry into boss's privacy. I just want to know how confident boss is in escaping from the Saint Emperor. You should be able to tell me, right? Hearing Chun Chongqing's words, Lu Zi was silent for a moment before replying, I don't know. Qin Changxing was stunned when he heard this. How could you not know? Luzi looked at Qin Changxing and shook her head. I really don't know. It wasn't that Luzi didn't want to tell Qin Changxing, but that she really didn't know. This was because when Qin Chuan transmitted his voice to her, he only said 3 words. Trust me. Besides these 3 words, Qin Chuan did not say anything else to Luzi. Luzi had always been Qin Chuan's staunchest supporter, and Qin Chuan had never disappointed Luzi. This time, although Qin Chuan did not give Luzi any promises or divulge any information to Luzi, the 3 words "trust me" made it impossible for Luzi to doubt Qin Chuan. She had thought that her decision might cause Qin Chuan to fall into danger or even die. She had also thought about whether her blind trust in Qin Chuan was right or not. Would it cause Qin Chuan to become overconfident and cause some bad things to happen? But after thinking about it and seeing Qin Chuan's determined gaze and serious tone, she ultimately decided to trust Qin Chuan. Chapter 1369. After leaving planet Iki, Qin Chuan didn't immediately leave the Iki Nebula. Instead, he concealed himself and returned to planet Iki. He wanted to wait for a while and see if there were any high-ranking spies within the righteous army. Qin Chuan waited for 3 days on planet Iki. During these 3 days, he did find some spies, but these spies were all captured by Yaorao when they were trying to spread the news. They were just some unimportant chess pieces. At the same time, during these 3 days, Qin Chuan also confirmed one thing. That was the fact that he left planet Iki alone was not leaked. In other words, there should be no traitor among the higher-ups at the meeting that day. This result made Qin Chuan feel very gratified. Sure enough, everyone walked together because they were like-minded. After confirming that there were no hidden dangers on planet Iki, Qin Chuan left planet Iki and the Iki Nebula. Other people didn't know why Qin Chuan wanted to test the Holy Emperor's strength. That was because they didn't know that after the fall of Kasisna and Su Ling, the Void Empire would once again give birth to a Grade 1 expert who was comparable to the ultimate existence. If they couldn't take advantage of this opportunity to deal with the hidden danger Zerg, then after Zadier became a Grade 1 expert, once he joined forces with Zerg again, they would have at least 3 ultimate existences. Who could resist such a terrifying force? Therefore, Qin Chuan must find a way to determine the Holy Emperor's strength. If the Holy Emperor was just bluffing and wasn't an ultimate existence, that would naturally be excellent. But if the Holy Emperor was really an ultimate existence, then he must find a way to kill the Holy Emperor before Zadier arrived. Although it sounded like Qin Chuan's idea was a bit too unrealistic and overestimated his own ability, but Qin Chuan was such a person. When he wanted to do something, the first thing he considered was not the consequences of failure, but to do it first. It was better to wait until the failure came and then think about the consequences. Now, our side. Let's call it our side for the time being. There are 2 ultimate existences, namely heaven and the one true God, atheists. Other than that, there is also a suspected ultimate existence, the Celestial Emperor. Meanwhile, on the other side, Zerg had the Zerg Queen, and the Void Empire had you. Apart from that, there was almost a 100% chance that Zadier would be able to advance to rank 1, and the Saint Emperor was suspected to be an ultimate existence. In other words, the difference between us and the other party is at least 1 supreme existence, and at most 2. Although I've never seen an ultimate existence in action, I can tell that the difference between an ultimate existence and an ultimate existence is enough to change the outcome of a war based on that strike of Demon Emperor. If we want to win, the first thing we need to do is to weaken Zerg as much as possible before the Void Empire and Zerg unite again. Compared to the Brood Mother, the Saint Emperor is undoubtedly the best choice. As long as I can confirm that the Sage Emperor is not a supreme existence, then I am confident that I can kill him. But if he really is a supreme existence, thinking of this, Qin Chuan's expression couldn't help but become a little serious. 2 days later, Qin Chuan arrived at planet Chaos Stone. The current messy stone star was no longer the same place as before. The Tian clan army had already completely occupied this place and planned it as an important military area. The residents who originally lived on Messy Stone Star had already been moved to other planets by the Tian clan. After Qin Xuan silently infiltrated the military base of planet Chaos Stone, he discovered many Zerg spies in just a few moments. One of the Zerg spies even held a high position, enough to influence the military advisor's arrangements to a certain extent. After discovering this, Qin Xuan did not take any action. He quietly left the military base of planet Chaos Stone and flew towards the interstellar portal. The two sides of the interstellar portal were occupied by the Tian people. If Zerg tried to attack the portal on the Holy Cluster's side, the Tian people would immediately cut off the portal's power supply. In that case, it would take Zerg at least 2 months to get to planet Chaos Stone. Furthermore, he would have to pass through the asteroid belt, which would be very troublesome. Although there were several overlords at the pinnacle of the body integration stage, guarding the interstellar teleportation gate, it was still difficult for these overlords to detect Qin Xuan's whereabouts. Therefore, Qin Xuan passed through the interstellar teleportation gate very easily and didn't even attract the attention of the surveillance system. After passing through the surveillance system and arriving at the Holy Cluster, Qin Xuan's figure flickered, and he was thousands of kilometers away without being detected. Qin Xuan wasn't sure if his stealth technique would work on the Saint Emperor, but he knew that the Saint Emperor was still in the Sage Monarch continent. If the Saint Emperor was a Paragon expert, he should be able to detect him. If he wasn't, then there was no way he would be able to detect him. As such, Qin Xuan decided to find a place where he wouldn't be too secretive. Then he would wait patiently for the Saint Emperor to come knocking on his door. If the Saint Emperor didn't come, then it would mean that he wasn't a Paragon expert, and Qin Xuan would take the initiative to cause trouble for him. After flying for about half a day, Qin Xuan chose a random planet and landed in the corner of a city. After Qin Xuan landed, he sized up his surroundings. Then he disguised his face, chose a hotel that looked decent, and checked in. After entering the hotel, Qin Xuan checked the environment and then plunged into the small cultivation room that came with the room. He stayed there for 10 days. During those 10 days, no one came to disturb Qin Xuan. Qin Xuan released his psychic power to the god focus level, but he didn't sense anyone suspicious. In other words, after 10 days, Zerg still hadn't discovered him. If Zerg had discovered him, then there was no reason for him to not take action. Let's wait for another 10 days. If there's still no movement, then I'll go to the Sage Monarch continent. Qin Xuan decided to wait for another 10 days. After that, he would head to the Sage Monarch continent and confront the Saint Emperor. It was at this time that Qin Xuan, who had gone out to get some fresh air, heard some news from the conversations of the people. During the 10 days he was in seclusion, the army of the Righteous Army had completely assembled and was rushing to Chaotic Rockstar. Within a month, they would launch an attack on the Saint Star cluster. The people on this planet, which was relatively close to the interstellar portal, were panicking. It was as if the army of righteousness was right in front of them, and death was imminent. Chapter 1370. When Qin Xuan heard that the army of righteousness was going to launch an attack on the Holy Cluster within a month, his first thought was that the army of righteousness had deliberately leaked the information to him. The army of righteousness is going to launch an attack on the Holy Cluster within a month. In other words, I only have 1 month left. In 1 month, if Qin Xuan could find out whether the Sage Emperor was real or not and confirm whether the Sage Emperor was a supreme existence, it would have a massive impact on the subsequent actions of the Masters of Justice. If the Sage Emperor had really reached the pinnacle of existence, then the army of Justice's plan to attack would be abandoned. No one was a fool. Knowing that the Sage Emperor had already reached the pinnacle of existence, no one was willing to provoke him. On the other hand, if they could confirm that the Saint Emperor was just bluffing and that he really wasn't a consummate entity, then the army of righteousness would be able to launch an attack on the Holy Cluster without worrying about anything else. That was why Qin Xuan's information was extremely important. 10 days. I'll stay here for 10 more days. If nothing happens in 10 days, I'll head to the Sage Monarch continent. Qin Xuan walked around outside. After discovering that there was nothing else, He returned to the hotel and continued to wait patiently in the cultivation room. On the other side, the army of justice, who had already rushed to chaotic Rockstar, was currently holding a second high-level meeting. Because Qin Chuan wasn't present, the seat of honor was empty. Chun Chongqing pulled out a chair and sat next to it, indicating that he was the temporary commander-in-chief. Chun Chongqing looked around and said, "Everyone, the news that the Army of Righteousness is going to launch an attack on the Holy Cluster within a month has already spread. I'm sure the boss has heard about it." Chun Chongqing felt a bit helpless. If they hadn't sent a message to Qin Chuan and received no response from Qin Chuan's photonic computer, they wouldn't have spread the news to Qin Chuan. Hearing Chun Chongqing's words, Tian San frowned. Now that we have lost contact with Qin Chuan, if Qin Chuan encounters any danger, we have no way of knowing. Ningya, who was sitting next to Lu Zi, replied, "I have Qin Chuan's life medallion. I can confirm if Qin Chuan is dead or alive." Ever since Qin Chuan had begun his cultivation, he had only created a single life medallion, and that was the one in Ningya's hand. She was the only person who could confirm if Qin Chuan was dead or alive. Tian San nodded and said to Ningya, "That's fine. However, if we don't receive news from Qin Chuan in a month, are we really going to start a war?" When everyone heard Tian San's words, they all turned their heads to look at Chun Chongqing. Qin Chuan was not here, so Chun Chongqing was everyone's backbone. Whether or not they would start a war after a month, it would be up to Chun Chongqing to decide. Chun Chongqing pondered for a moment under everyone's gazes before saying, "In a month, we'll start a war regardless of whether the boss sends back news or not. However, it won't be a full-scale attack, but a probing attack." Chun Chongqing didn't dare to launch a full-scale attack without confirming the Saint King's cultivation. Every decision he made would affect the lives of billions or even billions of people. As a result, he needed to be extremely cautious. A partial probing attack? Everyone looked at each other when they heard Chun Chongqing's words. A while later, Huang Feng said to Chun Chongqing, "Can you be more specific about this probing attack?" Chun Chongqing nodded. "We'll send a portion of our forces into the Holy Cluster first and attack the peripheral galaxies of the Holy Cluster. We'll do it step by step. If we encounter any danger, we'll be able to retreat in time, and the losses won't be too great." Huang Feng asked again after hearing Chun Chongqing's explanation, "Then how many soldiers should we send for this probing attack?" Chun Chongqing thought for a moment before replying, 300 million. Time passed quickly. In the blink of an eye, another 10 days had passed. Qin Chuan emerged from the hotel's cultivation room. He had already been in the hotel for 20 days. During that time, he hadn't made any effort to hide his presence, nor had he set up any sealing spell formations to prevent others from spying on him. And yet, there had been no response from Zerg. It was almost as if they hadn't noticed him at all. Qin Chuan didn't want to wait any longer, so he took the initiative to head to the Sage Monarch continent. Based on my speed, it should take about half a month to reach the Sage Monarch continent. At that point, I'll only have 5 days to find out more about the Sage Monarch continent. I have to get some results in 5 days. If not, Qin Chuan frowned, then vanished from the hotel's living room. A moment later, he reappeared outside of the planet, heading in the direction of the Sage Monarch continent. While Qin Chuan was on his way to the Sage Monarch continent, the Masters of Righteousness crusade against Zerg had attracted more and more attention. Most people supported the Masters of Righteousness, even if they didn't know the full story. As a result, the Masters of Righteousness became more and more famous, while Zerg's reputation became more and more tarnished. In the past, in the Saint Star cluster, the insectoids were the center of attention no matter where they went. They were high and mighty nobles. But now, in the Holy Cluster, Zerg's people were the center of attention when they walked on the streets. The only difference was that the people who looked at them no longer looked at them with respect and admiration, but with hatred and enmity. Zerg's insistence on starting a war had attracted the attention of the Masters of Righteousness. That was what most people who weren't Zerg were thinking. Now that the war was coming, no one knew if the Army of Justice would target the insectoids alone after entering the Saint Star cluster, or if they would treat everyone equally. Many innocent people who had not participated in the war were on tenterhooks because of this. It was also because of this that they loathed the insectoids. If he wasn't strong enough, why would he cause trouble? As the conflicts accumulated, the hatred of the other races toward the Zergs gradually accumulated to the peak. There were even incidents of Zergs being attacked on streets. Chapter 1371. The two Zerg soldiers were lying on the ground, their throats ripped open. Blood gushed out of their wounds, dyeing the street a dark green. At this time, most of the people on the street had already hidden either at the corner of the street or by the window facing the street, quietly watching the situation on the street. Although many of them hated the insectoids, this was the first time someone dared to openly attack an insectoid on the street. Everyone could see that the person who had attacked the Zerg soldiers was a mountain tribe member. The reason for the attack was because the two Zerg soldiers had mocked the mountain tribe members for looking like stones, stupid, and lowly. The mountain tribe members were famous for their stupidity and had been mocked by countless people in the past for being stupid and lowly. In the past, the mountain tribe members would silently accept such criticism without retorting. But this time, they stood up and used the so-called noble blood of the Zerg soldiers to prove one thing. The mountain tribe also had a temper. When an ordinary man was angry, blood would splatter 5 steps away. After killing the two Zerg soldiers, the mountain tribe member was so frightened that he disappeared without a trace. More than half an hour had passed, and the two Zerg soldiers' corpses were still lying on the street. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened in the entire Saint Star cluster. Under the provocation of some people, the Order of the Holy Cluster was on the verge of collapse. In order to save time on the Sage Monarch continent, Qin Xuan had originally expected to take 10 days to complete the journey. Instead, it only took him 8. By this point, Qin Xuan was on the outskirts of the Sage Monarch continent and could see it from a distance. The Sage Monarch continent was the core of Zerg, and only the Zerg had the right to enter. Without permission, no one from any other race could enter. If they were caught trespassing, they would be executed on the spot. Qin Xuan had heard of the Sage Monarch continent before, but he didn't know much about it. Therefore, he planned to observe it from the outskirts for a while before sneaking in. During his time in hiding, Qin Xuan discovered that the Sage Monarch continent was covered by an enormous spell formation. It was a combination of modern technology and could identify anyone who entered or left the continent. If someone didn't use the designated entrance or exit, the spell formation would immediately detect them and send out an alarm. Qin Xuan didn't know how long the spell formation had been in operation for, and he wasn't sure if he would be discovered. After thinking about it, Qin Xuan decided to enter the Sage Monarch continent through Zerg's designated entrance. Qin Xuan didn't know how to get in. Zerg's designated entrance was to the east of the Sage Monarch continent. There was a huge teleportation gate that led to the Sage Monarch continent. However, in order to get in, one needed to have a pass. Zerg issued the passes, and they were limited in number. Unless one was a member of Zerg's people, it was almost impossible for anyone to get a pass. Of course, there were exceptions, such as body integration experts who joined Zerg and worked for Zerg. Qin Xuan waited patiently not too far away from the entrance. He let any member of Zerg's people pass by. Qin Xuan was worried that he might run into someone he knew in the Sage Monarch continent. Therefore, Qin Xuan's targets were those who had joined Zerg. Hard work paid off. After waiting for less than 2 hours, Qin Xuan finally found an outsider who had joined the Zergs. A pitch-black spaceship flew past Qin Xuan. Qin Xuan's body flickered as he slipped into the cabin. Using his psychic power, he could tell that there were 5 people on the ship. One of them was a mid-body integration expert, while the other 4 were at the peak of the Dongshu level. The mid-body integration stage overlord, Qin Xuan, would not move. His target was the 4 servants of this mid-body integration stage overlord. Qin Xuan picked one of the servants, who was in the middle of cultivating in his bedroom, and knocked him unconscious. Then he took all of his belongings, opened a spatial portal, and teleported him to a location thousands of kilometers away. There was no way he would wake up for the next 10 days. Qin Xuan changed into the servant's clothes and placed all of his belongings back in place. Then he disguised himself as the servant. Once he was in the bedroom, he pretended to be in the middle of cultivating. But in reality, he was observing the situation outside. These people probably didn't notice what I was doing. As long as they don't check my identity, I should be able to hide it from them. That said, I should have interrogated the servant first. I should have gotten some information about him before sending him away. Right now, I don't know anything about him other than his name. In this case, if I meet a companion who is very familiar with him, then I will be in danger of being exposed. That's why I should leave this ship as soon as I enter the Sage Monarch continent. As for whether or not the disappearance of the servant will attract attention after I leave, that's not something I need to worry about right now. But even if it does, it won't matter. They might not be able to link this matter to me. While Qin was thinking about these issues, the spaceship arrived at the portal to the Sage Monarch continent. It slowly came to a stop, and the cabin door opened. Zerg's personnel boarded the ship for a routine inspection. Zerg's personnel didn't conduct a particularly strict inspection. They only confirmed that the number of people on the ship was correct and their identities were correct. Qin, who had been prepared for the inspection, let out a long sigh of relief. Of course, it would be best if he didn't have to be inspected. After the inspection, the spaceship was allowed to pass through the portal and slowly disappeared. After the spaceship left, the Zerg personnel who were inspecting the spaceship suddenly had a look of relief on their faces. It was as if they had just experienced something extremely dangerous. If Qin had seen this scene, he would have realized that something was wrong. Unfortunately, he didn't see it. Chapter 1372. After passing through the portal, Qin was greeted by the sight of a huge, golden continent. Qin stood in front of the porthole and observed for a moment. Then, his figure flashed and appeared outside the spacecraft in the next moment. He quickly flew into the distance and disappeared into the horizon in the blink of an eye. Although this was Qin's first time in the Sage Monarch continent, and he didn't know much about it, he knew that the Saint Emperor lived in the most magnificent building in the center of the continent. Following that line of thought, finding the Saint Emperor shouldn't be too difficult. Qin remained hidden in the air, stretching his psychic power to its limit. He had assumed that his psychic power would be strong enough to cover half of the Sage Monarch continent. But to his surprise, his psychic power was only able to extend for about 10,000 kilometers before being restricted. My psychic power is restricted? What's going on? Qin frowned. His psychic power being restricted meant that the information he could gather was reduced by more than 80%. Even with Qin's skill and courage, he couldn't help but feel uneasy. All along, Qin had relied on his mental energy that had reached the spirit condensation stage. Under the circumstances where his mental energy was stronger than others, Qin could always seize the initiative. But now, with his mental energy being restricted, Qin's biggest advantage no longer existed. This was a huge blow to Qin's strength. Is this something special about the Sage Monarch continent? Or am I being targeted? Qin couldn't help but wonder. If his psychic power was restricted because of the Sage Monarch continent, like how the exiled lands limited the cultivation bases of high-level cultivators, then it wouldn't be a big deal. But if his psychic power was restricted because he was being targeted, then the situation was not good. Qin looked down at the Sage Monarch continent below him. He could see many Zerg working in the cities, as well as Zerg working in the wilderness. He didn't sense anything out of the ordinary among the Zerg, which meant that he hadn't been exposed yet. If I've been exposed, then there's no reason why the Saint Emperor hasn't made a move against me yet. I should be safe for now. With that in mind, Qin felt a bit more at ease. Then he headed down toward the city of Zerg, where he could gather some information. Before landing, Qin had already draped a cloak over his body, concealing his appearance. Previously, when he was investigating the situation, he discovered that many people in this city were dressed similarly and did not reveal their true faces. Therefore, it was not strange for him to do this, and there was no risk of arousing suspicion. If he wanted to gather information, he would have to go to the most crowded places where dragons and snakes mingled. In most cities, such places were either nighttime establishments or taverns that were open during the day. As it was daytime, Qin Chuan walked into a tavern on the side of the street. He stood at the door and looked around. There weren't many people drinking at this time of the day, but there weren't few either. There were about 7 or 8 tables of customers. Qin Chuan picked a table in the corner and ordered some drinks and snacks. Then he began to quietly eat and drink while listening to the conversations of others. If you ask me, we should act tough. We shouldn't wait for the army of justice to come. We should take the initiative to attack and catch them off guard. A tall insectoid male, whose face was slightly red from drinking, shouted loudly. He seemed to be very dissatisfied with the insectoid's performance. The army of justice had already arrived at their doorstep, yet there was no response from the insectoids. It was indeed a little unreasonable. Of course, there was no way he would say such a thing out loud. If he did, he would disappear from this city forever. What do you know? Those guys have a moral high ground now. We've already been scolded badly enough. If we take the initiative to declare war, I'm afraid we'll drown in their saliva. Someone refuted the tall Zerg man. Although Zerg had always been a man of his word in the Holy Cluster, without the support of other races, Zerg couldn't rely on his own strength to maintain the rule of the Holy Cluster. So sometimes, Zerg still had to consider the issue of reputation. In the previous war, Zerg stood his ground against the opinions of the masses and resolutely started the war. As a result, they suffered heavy losses. Now that the endless allied army had split off and sent an army of justice to suppress them, Zerg, who knew that he was in the wrong, naturally wouldn't do anything to tarnish their reputation. Then, in my opinion, why don't the Holy Emperor imitate the Demon King and simply admit defeat, then publicly apologize? That way, there won't be any more wars. What are you talking about? Be careful with your words. As soon as the tall Zerg's voice fell, the expressions of the other Zerg sitting at the same table suddenly became very ugly. Talking about the Holy Emperor in public. Are you tired of living? At this time, the tall Zerg who had drunk too much also knew that he had broken his promise. His expression also became very ugly. Everyone no longer had the mood to continue drinking and dispersed. Qin Chuan saw the tall Zerg get up and walk to the second floor of the tavern. He also got up and followed him. He saw the tall Zerg enter a room on the second floor. After waiting for a while, his figure flashed and entered the room. When Qin Chuan entered the room, the tall Zerg was already lying on the bed, snoring loudly. Qin Chuan glanced around the room, then slowly walked to the tall Zerg's side. He raised his right hand and pressed his right hand on the tall Zerg's head. A powerful mental force flowed through his fingers into the tall Zerg's brain and intertwined with the tall Zerg's mental force. In an instant, the tall Zerg's memories flowed through Qin Chuan's mental force and into Qin Chuan's mind. The impact of the huge and jumbled memories caused Qin Chuan's mind to feel uncomfortable. However, Qin Chuan only frowned slightly. He endured the discomfort and read the key information in the tall Zerg's memories. A moment later, he withdrew his right hand from the tall Zerg's head. The tall Zerg had fallen into a deep sleep. Qin Chuan only glanced at the dead Zerg for a moment before looking away. So the Sage Emperor lives in a place called the Sage Palace. It's located in the middle of the Sage Monarch continent, on top of the highest mountain. Although, it seems strange that the insectoids aren't doing anything about the righteous army. Chapter 1373. After reading Zerg's memories, Qin Chuan learned 4 things. The first was about the whereabouts of the Saint Emperor. Barring any mishaps, the Saint Emperor should be in his Sage Palace, located in the central region of the Sage Monarch continent. The second thing was about the Army of Righteousness. It had been 20 days since the Army of Righteousness declared war on Zerg, and yet Zerg hadn't responded at all. That didn't seem right. Normally, the insectoids would only have 2 choices in the face of such a situation. One was to admit defeat like the demons and then publicly apologize, compensate those who needed to be compensated, and disarm those who needed to be reduced. The second was to continue the war and take back everything that had been lost. However, the insectoids chose the third option that did not exist in the list of options, which was silence. From what Qin Chuan could tell, this wasn't Zerg's style at all. However, Qin Chuan felt that it was more like Zerg didn't care about the Army of Righteousness declaration of war at all. And the only person who had the qualifications to ignore the righteous army was the Sage Emperor. And for the Saint Emperor to be so confident, that person had to be extraordinarily strong. Therefore, from that perspective, the Saint Emperor was very likely to be a supreme existence. However, after what had happened in the past month, Qin Chuan couldn't help but wonder. The third thing was that because of Zerg's silence, Zerg's internal conflicts had arisen. Some people hoped that the higher-ups of the Zerg clan would make a statement, whether it was to fight or to admit defeat. At the very least, they wanted to make a statement. There were also some people who believed that the Army of Righteousness was just bluffing, and that there was no way they would actually invade the Sage Monarch continent. The reason they thought the Army of Righteousness was bluffing was because of the Endless Allied Army's attitude toward the Devils. At that time, the Endless Alliance Army had just destroyed the Void Empire's Expeditionary Army. Whether it was in terms of strength or morale, they had the absolute upper hand. If the Endless Alliance Army wanted to attack the Great Demonic Star Cluster, the demons would not have been able to resist. However, the Endless Alliance Army did not do so. They only asked the demons to agree to some terms and let them go. Now that the Endless Allied Army had been disbanded, the Righteous Army was only formed by a small part of the Endless Allied Army. In terms of strength, they were much weaker than the Endless Allied Army. In the eyes of these people, the Righteous Army was nothing more than a fox exploiting the tiger's might. The real purpose of the Army of Justice was definitely not to start a war, but to force the higher-ups of Zerg to admit defeat and then publicly apologize like the Demon King. Therefore, the possibility of another war breaking out was very small. When Qin Chuan read this part of the memories, he felt that these people were right. If the higher-ups of Zerg were willing to admit defeat and publicly apologize, the Army of Justice would not start a war against the Holy Cluster. The next time a war would break out, it would be when the Void Empire descended. However, if these people thought that as long as the higher-ups of Zerg didn't show up, the Army of Justice would continue to be in a deadlock and would only threaten them verbally and not actually start a war, then they were very wrong. The last thing Qin Chuan cared about the most was the last thing. Ever since the Saint Emperor changed his title from Sage Monarch to Saint Emperor 4,000 years ago, the symbol of Zerg, the insectoid queen, had not shown her divinity in front of the masses. According to Zerg's tradition, every 1,000 years, the Sage Monarch continent would hold a Holy Mother sacrifice. The Holy Mother sacrifice would last for a month, and on the last day of the month, the Holy Mother would show her divinity in front of the masses and descend with holy light. Anyone who was illuminated by the holy light would have a smooth-sailing future in their cultivation. However, ever since the Saint Emperor changed his title, Zerg had not shown his divinity in front of the masses for 4 consecutive Holy Mother sacrifices, and the holy light no longer shone upon the masses. Zerg's inner circle was abuzz with discussion about this. The Saint Emperor explained that the insectoid queen was at a critical point in her cultivation, and that was why she did not show her divinity in front of the masses. Once the insectoid queen finished her seclusion, the Holy Mother sacrifice would return to normal. Zerg chose to believe the Saint Emperor's explanation. After all, the Saint Emperor was the only person in Zerg who was qualified to communicate with the insectoid queen. There was no reason for them to doubt the Saint Emperor. However, Qin Chuan didn't think so. The way he saw it, the fact that the insectoid queen wasn't showing her divinity in front of the masses had something to do with the Saint Emperor changing his title. Otherwise, it would be too much of a coincidence for the insectoid queen to go into seclusion right after the Saint Emperor changed his title. Most importantly, the insectoid queen was already a paragon. If she went into seclusion, would she be able to reach an even higher level? Not even the peerless genius you had been able to take that step. Therefore, Yang Qi didn't think the insectoid queen would be able to. It seems there's something going on between the Saint Emperor and the insectoid queen. Perhaps the insectoid queen has already perished. Qin Chuan narrowed his eyes, a strange expression on his face. His guess was that the Saint Emperor had become a paragon because of the insectoid queen's death. The insectoid queen controls the law of desire. In the past, I've never heard of anyone comprehending the law of desire. Even if I'm ignorant and have never heard of this, the Tian people and the Protoss would definitely pay attention to this. If someone had comprehended the law of desire, they should have noticed it. Therefore, if the insectoid queen has perished, the Saint Emperor must have inherited the insectoid queen's law of desire through some means, and then ascended to paragon. But is that really the case? Am I being a little too simplistic? First of all, the insectoid queen's death is a huge point of suspicion. After a moment of thought, Qin Chuan couldn't help but wonder if his train of thought was correct. If the insectoid queen had really perished, then how did it die? Could it have been assassinated by the Saint Emperor? But the insectoid queen was a paragon. Would it be so easy to assassinate her? Furthermore, the Saint Emperor didn't seem to have any reason to assassinate the insectoid queen. Qin Chuan didn't even consider the possibility of the insectoid queen dying of old age. Since ancient times, there had only been a few paragon existences. He had never heard of a paragon being dying of natural causes. Things seem to be getting more and more complicated, but also simpler and simpler. As long as I can confirm the Saint Emperor's cultivation, all my questions will be answered. Thinking of this, the expression on Qin Chuan's face gradually became resolute. He had to go to the sacred palace as soon as possible. Chapter 1374. Thanks to Zerg's memories, Qin Chuan knew where the Sage Palace was. Therefore, Qin Chuan didn't hesitate to head there. It took him 3 days to get from Qin Chuan's city to the Sage Palace. That was as fast as Qin Chuan could go, without anyone noticing. When Qin Chuan reached the highest mountain in the Sage Monarch continent, the Sagely Mountain, he looked up and saw that it was so tall that not even Qin Chuan could see its peak. As for the Sage Palace, there was no sign of it. So this is the Sagely Mountain. The Sage Palace should be at the peak. But I can't see the peak, and I can't see the Sage Palace either. They must be hidden by some sort of sealing spell formation. Qin Chuan frowned as he looked at the Sagely Mountain. He didn't know where to start. Even when his psychic power was at its peak, he wouldn't have dared to break through the sealing spell formations of the Sage Monarch continent, much less now that his psychic power was limited. I have to figure out a way to get to the peak. Amidst the clouds, Qin Chuan scanned his surroundings, hoping to find some clues. Just as Qin Chuan was searching for clues, the scene in front of him suddenly blurred. This caused Qin Chuan to be startled. In the next moment, his figure appeared in a huge square. At the end of the square, a magnificent and majestic palace stood there, majestic and dignified. When Qin Chuan saw this, he couldn't help but think of 2 words: the Sage Palace. This isn't an illusion. But how did I end up in the Sage Palace? Qin Chuan's heart was pounding. Even as he thought about this, the tightly shut doors of the Sage Palace slowly opened. Qin Chuan's pupils constricted as a bad premonition welled up in his heart. Without even thinking about it, he turned to leave the square. However, a terrifying pressure bore down on him, making it impossible for him to move. Qin Chuan had the feeling that if he dared to take even a single step back, he would be crushed to dust by the pressure. Only by walking forward would the pressure lessen. I've been tricked, Qin Chuan thought. If he still couldn't figure out what was going on, he would have lived his life in vain. Tap! Qin Chuan took a step forward, then a second. As the pressure on him lessened, Qin Chuan's expression gradually calmed down. At this point, there was no point in being anxious. He could only take things one step at a time. As Qin Chuan walked step by step into the majestic Sage Palace, the pressure that had enveloped him disappeared. Qin Chuan stood at the entrance of the Sage Palace and looked inside. The first thing he saw was Huai Chong standing in the center. He had some impression of Huai Chong. Back then, Blackface had risked his life to cover Huai Chong's retreat. As a result, Huai Chong was the second tribulation stage existence after Furio to escape from Qin Chuan's hands. Now that he saw Huaichang again, Qin Chuan was surprised to find that Huaichang's aura was much stronger than before. Huaichang had already stepped into the ranks of demigods. While Qin Chuan was sizing up Huaichang was also looking at Qin Chuan. However, she didn't seem surprised by Qin Chuan's arrival. It was as if she had expected Qin Chuan's arrival. Qin Chuan, I've been waiting for you for a long time. A low and faintly discernible voice came from the high platform in the depths of the great hall, drawing Qin Chuan's attention. He subconsciously turned his head to look at the high platform, but he could only see a blurry figure. However, Qin Chuan could guess that the person who had the qualifications to sit in the Sage Palace was definitely the Sage Emperor. I want to know, when was I exposed? Qin Chuan was very curious about when the Sage Emperor had discovered his existence. The Sage Emperor wasn't stingy with his answer to Qin Chuan's question. He indifferently said, "From the beginning, you were under my watch." Qin Chuan slightly frowned and said, "If I was exposed from the beginning, why didn't you make a move against me?" Qin Chuan was very curious about this and wanted to know if the Sage Emperor had been lying to him. In response to Qin Chuan's question, the Sage Emperor coolly said, "I didn't make a move against you from the beginning because I wanted you to come to the Sage Monarch continent and come to me of your own accord." Qin Chuan's heart sank. "How did you know I would come to the Sage Monarch continent?" "I looked into your past," the Sage Emperor said coolly. "I know more about you than you can possibly imagine, and I value you more." The Sage Emperor indifferently said, "You're a very confident person, but you're also an extremely bold person. The more I avoid you and ignore you, the more you'll think of ways to get close to me. Then you'll self-righteously guess at a few things and reveal some so-called truths. Your human race has a saying that curiosity kills the cat. You should understand this saying better than I do." The Sage Emperor's words caused Qin Chuan's heart to sink even further. Never could he have guessed that the Sage Emperor had been watching him all along. Furthermore, the Sage Emperor had long since guessed that he would come to the Sage Monarch continent for various reasons. That was why he had been patiently waiting for him to come knocking on his door. Curiosity kills the cat. Curiosity really does kill. Qin Chuan looked deeply at the Sage Emperor's blurry figure. "So you've really reached the Paragon level?" This time, the Sage Emperor did not answer Qin Chuan's question. He was silent for a while before he said, "You put yourself in such a dangerous situation just to find out the answer to this question. Aren't you afraid of dying?" "Of course I'm afraid of dying," Qin Chuan said. "But compared to dying, I'm more afraid of dying without knowing why." From Qin Chuan's point of view, if the Sage Emperor was a Paragon-level existence, then no matter where he was, as long as the Sage Emperor wanted to kill him, he wouldn't be able to escape death. In response to Qin Chuan's thirst for knowledge, the Sage Emperor let out a rare chuckle. But then he looked at Qin Chuan and said, "To express my admiration for you, I'll answer a question for you before you die." Without hesitation, Qin Chuan asked, "Is the broodmother still alive?" The Sage Emperor hadn't expected Qin Chuan to ask such a question. After a long moment of silence, he replied, "For the time being, she could be considered alive." Qin Chuan frowned. For the time being, she could be considered alive? Was she dead or alive? Without waiting for Qin Chuan to ask, the Sage Emperor said, "The broodmother is still alive, but not in her original form. She's living in a different way." Chapter 1375. Another Way to Survive? Qin Chuan could not help but be confused when he heard the Saint Emperor's words. What did he mean? The Saint Emperor saw Qin Chuan's confusion and asked indifferently, "Do you want to know more?" Qin Chuan nodded and said, "What you're telling me now is no different from not telling me at all. If you want to know more, then give me information that interests me." The Saint Emperor looked at Qin Chuan and said, "It's a fair trade." Qin Chuan glanced at the Saint Emperor in surprise and said, "I have no objections." Hui Qian stood to one side and watched the Saint Emperor and Qin Chuan talk. He could not help but have an extremely strange feeling. Right now, Qin Chuan and the Saint Emperor were like two old friends who had not seen each other for many years. The atmosphere was extremely harmonious, and hostility did not exist at all. Qin Chuan looked at his prestige and pursed his lips slightly. He said, "Courtesy demands reciprocity. You've already answered one of my questions earlier. Although it's not the complete answer, it's still an answer, so you can ask your question first this time." Upon hearing Qin Chuan's words, the Saint Emperor didn't stand on ceremony and directly asked, "Has your mind power realm broken through its limits?" Qin Chuan never thought that the Saint Emperor would actually ask him this question. He looked at the Saint Emperor and asked curiously, "So my spiritual force really has been restricted by you on purpose?" The Saint Emperor nodded. "After you, no other 9th-ranked talisman formation master has been born in this universe. You're the second 9th-ranked talisman formation master after you, so I'm guessing that your spiritual force should be the same as you's. You've broken through your limits." Qin Chuan nodded and frankly replied, "That's right. My mental strength has indeed broken through the limit. You should know that when I was chased by Furo, I once used my own strength to inscribe an interstellar teleportation array and escape from Furo's clutches. It was at that time that I completed my breakthrough." Qin Chuan was speaking the truth, but he did not explain in detail how he broke through. The Saint Emperor was silent for a moment after hearing Qin Chuan's answer. After a while, he said to Qin Chuan, "It's your turn to ask your question." Qin Chuan heard this and said without hesitation, "I want to know what's going on with the insect queen. Please explain it more clearly." The sage emperor had already expected Qin Chuan to ask this question, so his answer was very straightforward, only 2 words. "Divine artifact." When Qin Chuan heard the sage emperor say the words divine artifact, his pupils couldn't help but constrict. Artifact. Zerg had turned into a divine artifact. The Saint Emperor looked at Qin Chuan and calmly said, "The insect queen has lost her consciousness, but she is still alive because she has turned into a divine artifact. However, this divine artifact is only half finished. Only when the insect queen's consciousness awakens will it be considered a true divine artifact." Qin Chuan looked deeply at the Saint Emperor and asked, "You're telling me such a shocking secret so honestly?" The Saint Emperor looked at Qin Chuan with a strange gaze and asked, "Do you think I need to lie to someone who is about to die? All right, let's just pretend that I'm about to die." Qin Chuan took a deep breath and said, "I've thought of many possibilities, but I never imagined that the insect queen would actually become a divine artifact. Many things must have happened in between." The Saint Emperor nodded and said, "There are indeed many twists and turns in this story. If you want to know, you'll have to exchange for other information." Qin Chuan asked the Saint Emperor, "What else do you want to know from me?" The Saint Emperor looked deeply at Qin Chuan and said, "The inheritance of the runic continent should be with you." When the Saint Emperor revealed Qin Chuan's greatest secret, even though Qin Chuan was doing his best to hide his emotions, he still revealed a look of shock. This matter had always been Qin Chuan's greatest secret. Even Lu Zi, who was closest to him and trusted him the most, did not know about it. How did the Saint Emperor know? Just as Qin Chuan's mind was in turmoil and filled with questions, the Saint Emperor said, "Don't be agitated. I can see that this matter is actually very simple." Qin Chuan looked at the Saint Emperor with an extremely grave gaze and asked, "How is it simple?" The Saint Emperor replied indifferently, "Your rise was too sudden, just like you in ancient times. Without any warning, you soared to the heavens and stunned the entire universe." Although the Saint Emperor had never seen you, he had heard countless stories about him. They were no longer simple stories, but more like myths and legends. The master of both humans and demons. The founder of the Talisman Array Master System. The owner of the runic sword. The strongest person in the universe. A great existence infinitely close to the God of creation. All of these were the labels that the later generations put on you. If you didn't suddenly attack the ancestral dragon and kill almost all the elites of the human race and the demon race in the ancient times, the universe today would be the territory of the human race. All the other races would have to live under the shadow of the human race, trembling in fear. After you disappeared, the human and demon races quickly fell from glory to decline. After disappearing from the universe for more than 10 million years, when the history of the human and demon races was about to be completely buried in the river of time, Qinchuan appeared. Qinchuan was like a dull stone that suddenly exploded with a bright light like the stars, illuminating the human and demon races that were about to fall into darkness. In just a few short decades, Qinchuan became a dark horse that caught everyone off guard and forced his way into everyone's vision. On the path of Qinchuan's rise, he repeatedly defeated strong enemies, turning all the obstacles into stairs on his path. Until today, Qinchuan had already grown into the most powerful and dazzling demigod. If there were no accidents, Qinchuan would definitely be like you in the future, becoming the strongest person in the world. Qinchuan and you were both from the human race. Both of them had risen without any warning. Both of them had grown to a height that others could only look up to in a short period of time. The speed at which they advanced had left others in the dust. There were too many similarities between Qinchuan and Yu. Back then, Yu's rise was because the Void race brought the runic continent and the runic sword. He used the power of the runes to complete his counterattack. Ever since the Imperial Emperor had disappeared, the runic continent had collapsed, and the runic sword had disappeared without a trace. Today, not many people still remembered the runic continent and the runic sword that had shaken the world in ancient times. However, Qinchuan's appearance had made the Saint Emperor remember everything. Chapter 1376. Qinchuan didn't answer the Divine Emperor's question verbally, but the Divine Emperor was able to glean the answer he wanted from the minute changes in Qinchuan's expression. The Divine Emperor gazed at the silent Qinchuan and sighed. This universe is really unfair. Why do such heaven-defying, fortuitous encounters fall into the hands of you, humans, time and time again? Before Qinchuan could reply, the Divine Emperor sighed with emotion. During the ancient times, you relied on the fortuitous encounters that the runic continent and the runic sword gave him to rise to power and become the strongest expert in the universe. He was full of ambition, and he imitated the ancestors of the human race and spread the human race's language throughout the universe. He unified the written language and even unified the culture. When he spoke up to this point, the Divine Emperor gazed deeply at Qinchuan. Do you know what the universe would be like now if you hadn't done those insane things during the ancient times? Qinchuan instinctively fantasized when he heard the Divine Emperor's words. If you hadn't suddenly gone mad and done those things, then perhaps the universe would have completely become the territory of the human race. All the other races would have become the vassals of the human race, and you would have become the true master of all races and illuminated the world with his radiance. We're very fortunate that you was a crazy person. If he wasn't, then we would be the ones who should be crazy. The Divine Emperor let out a long sigh. He felt sad for the geniuses of the same generation as you during the ancient times, and he also felt sad for the young people of the same generation as Qinchuan in this era. The so-called geniuses in front of Qinchuan would eventually lose their luster. Qinchuan fell silent for a moment when he heard the Divine Emperor's words, and then he said, "Everything you've said is only based on what if. In reality, the human race and the demon race have been dormant for over 10 million years, and it's time for them to rise once more. In the end, it's still because of the runic continent and the runic sword." The Divine Emperor gazed at Qinchuan and said, "You probably obtained a talisman sword, right? All those years ago when the talisman continent collapsed, the talisman sword was probably the only thing the talismans could rely on. If you didn't have the assistance of the talisman sword, it would be very difficult for you to advance into the 9th rank of Talisman Formation Master, right?" Qinchuan didn't answer the Sage Emperor's question, which could be considered as tacitly agreeing that the Sage Emperor was right. Although he didn't know how the bronze square box ended up in his hands, he did obtain a sea of runes through the bronze square box. At the same time, the bronze square box turned into a ring, which he had always worn on his finger. Previously, in order to disguise himself, he deliberately took off the bronze ring and stored it in his storage ring. Until now, Chuan still had no idea what this bronze ring could do. The sea of runes had vanished with the appearance of the runic sword. It was probably absorbed by the runic sword. If that wasn't the case, the runic sword probably wouldn't have been able to help him absorb the power of runes, simplify runes, or upgrade runes. Indeed, most of the credit for the abilities he had obtained was due to the runic swords. Seeing that Chuan was silent, the Sage Emperor said to Chuan, "Other questions do you have? Ask away." Chuan looked up at the Sage Emperor and asked, "How did your Zerg reach an agreement with the Void Empire back then?" Chuan clearly remembered that when the Imperial Army attacked the human and demon armies, the Zergs had also participated in the encirclement. If not for that, the elites of the human and demon races would not have been wiped out. Chuan really wanted to know what role Zerg had played in all these years. Hearing Chuan's question, the Sage Emperor was a little surprised. He thought that Chuan would continue to ask about the Brood Mother and the Divine Artifact. He didn't expect Chuan to change his target to the Void Empire. Although I wasn't the one who did it back then, I still have some understanding of it. The Sage Emperor was silent for a moment before answering Chuan's question. Before the rise of the human and Yao races, the overlords of this universe were us, who created the Divine Artifact, and the Protoss, who created the Divine Artifact. At that time, the only one who could suppress us was the Protoss. However, the rise of the human and Yao races changed the situation. They relied on the powerful runic sword and the brand new runic array system to surpass us and the Protoss, completely suppressing us. With the advantage of the Divine Artifact, the Protoss was able to compete with the human race. However, due to various reasons, we were defeated by the human race several times. The human race was proud and disdainfully called us Zerg. When he said the name Zerg, a sharp glint flashed across the Sage Emperor's eyes. Clearly, he hated this name very much. Ever since we created the Divine Artifact, for millions of years, no one dared to call us Zerg. The human race made our ancestors recall those unbearable memories of the past. The stronger the human race was, the more the sacred race would be mocked. Therefore, when a Void Empire extended an olive branch to us, we agreed to cooperate without hesitation. After hearing the Sage Emperor's explanation, Chuan finally had a clearer understanding of the grudge between the human race and Zerg. It turned out that the source of the grudge between the human race and Zerg that had lasted for tens of millions of years was because of an insignificant name. To the human race, the name Zerg might be used to mock Zerg, but to the self-proclaimed sacred race Zerg, it was the greatest insult to them. Since the Protoss had the Divine Artifact back then, how did the human race defeat the Protoss? Chuan was very curious. The human race had the runic sword, and the Protoss also had the Divine Artifact. Since that was the case, why was the Protoss no match for the human race? Was it just because of you? Chuan felt that there must be more to this than he knew. When the Sage Emperor heard Chuan's question, he said calmly, "From the ancient times until now, the Bug Queen has gone through 3 generations of inheritance, and the firmament has gone through 3 generations of inheritance, and the one true God, Atheist, has only existed since the ancient times." Do you know why? When Chuan heard this, he seemed to have thought of something. Extremely shocked, he said, "Could it be that the one true God, Atheist, is the Divine Artifact?" The Sage Emperor nodded and said, "The one true God, Atheist, is the spirit of the Divine Artifact. As long as the Divine Artifact is not destroyed, he will exist forever." Let me ask you, how can a Divine Artifact defeat the combination of a Universe Supreme Master and a Divine Artifact? After hearing the Sage Emperor's explanation, Chuan was really shocked. He had never thought that the one true God, Atheist, would be a Divine Artifact. This made Chuan think of Baiyu. If the Hope could become a Divine Artifact one day, wouldn't Baiyu also become an existence like the one true God, Atheist? Chapter 1377. The Sage Emperor looked at Chuan and continued. In ancient times, After the Protoss was defeated by the human race, Atheus established a church and worshipped himself as a true god. In his belief, only the spirit of a divine artifact could be immortal and exist with the world. Because of its uniqueness, the church was named the One God religion. This is an ancient secret. Even in the current One God religion, very few people know about this. Many Protoss believe that Atheus is their ancestor, but in fact, Atheus is just an artifact created by their ancestor. It's a pity that after tens of millions of years, the Protoss have already forgotten everything. When Qin Chuan heard the Sage Emperor's words, he looked deeply at him and asked, "So, the Insect Queen also wants to exist for eternity, so she turned herself into a divine artifact." The Sage Emperor nodded and said, "You're right. That's what the Insect Queen originally thought. Unfortunately, she's different from Atheus. She's doing the opposite. Atheus could become the one true god. First, he had to become a divine artifact. Then, he had to give birth to an artifact spirit and gain intelligence. Step by step, he reached where he was today. The Insect Queen was different. She wanted to refine herself into a divine artifact and use her own intelligence as the artifact spirit. However, some problems occurred during the refining process. As a result, although her physical body became a divine artifact, her intelligence failed to become an artifact spirit. Instead, she fell into a deep slumber. This also caused Zerg to become a half-finished product. If she wanted to become a true divine artifact and exist for eternity like the one true god Atheus, she needed to awaken her intelligence. Qin Chuan guessed that the Sage Emperor should have a way to awaken the Insect Queen's intelligence. However, for some reason, the Sage Emperor did not do so. "I've already answered your question. Now it's my turn." The Sage Emperor looked at Qin Chuan and said indifferently. In fact, he had answered more than one question from Qin Chuan, but he didn't care about it. Qin Chuan looked at the Sage Emperor and couldn't help but feel a little strange. He had a feeling that the two of them were here for a conference. He almost forgot that the one sitting on the stage was the Sage Emperor. My last question. With your understanding of the runic swords, do you think you can become an existence like the god of creation? Hearing the Sage Emperor's question, Qin Chuan couldn't help but stare blankly. This question was really difficult for him to answer. To tell you the truth, I have never seen you in person. You have always been a legendary figure. If you want me to answer your question, I have to at least see you before I can do so. The Sage Emperor became silent. After a while, he said to Qin Chuan, "Even if you answer my question, you can still ask me one last question." Hearing the words, "one last question," Qin Chuan couldn't help but become nervous. Once he asked this question and the Sage Emperor answered it, it would mean that their friendly exchange had come to an end. It was time to get serious. Qin Chuan pondered for a moment before asking the Sage Emperor, "My last question is, how can I escape from your hands?" Qin Chuan's question made the Sage Emperor speechless. Hui Cheng, who had been listening for a long time, couldn't help but look at Qin Chuan with a strange expression. How was the Sage Emperor supposed to answer this question? After a long period of silence, the Sage Emperor said to Qin Chuan, "How can you escape from my hands? Shouldn't you already have an answer in your heart?" Qin Chuan grinned and said, "The answer in my heart is my own answer. It's not the answer you gave me." When he spoke up to hear, Qin Chuan paused for a moment, and then he said, "If you don't know how to answer my question, then you can answer it later. I have other matters to attend to, so I'll be leaving first. Let's talk next time." With that, Qin Chuan turned around and walked out of the sacred palace. Although it was a great taboo to turn one's back to the enemy, in Qin Chuan's opinion, no matter how careful he was, it would be easy for the Sacred Emperor to kill him. Since that was the case, he might as well be a little more straightforward and open. Hui Cheng couldn't help but turn to look at the Sage Emperor, a look of suspicion on his face. Was the Sage Emperor really going to let Qin Chuan leave just like that? Qin Chuan walked out step by step, waiting for the Sage Emperor to say something or at least make a move to stop him. Hui Cheng was also waiting for the Sage Emperor to make a move. However, the strange thing was that even as Qin Chuan walked out of the Sage Palace and into the square, The Sage Emperor didn't say anything, nor did he make a move. Qin Chuan wasn't in the mood to let his thoughts run wild. As soon as he left the Sage Mountain, he flew off into the distance, preparing to leave the Sage Monarch continent and the Holy Cluster. Meanwhile, Hui Chong could sense Qin Chuan's figure getting farther and farther away. When Qin Chuan disappeared from her range of perception, she couldn't help but ask the Sage Emperor, "Are you really going to let him go just like that? If we miss this opportunity, it'll be very difficult for us to find another opportunity to kill him." Hearing Hui Chong's words, the Saint Emperor didn't immediately respond. After a while, the Saint Emperor asked Hui Chong, "Who do you think is the biggest threat to us?" Hui Qian was slightly stunned when he heard this, and then he said, "Isn't it Qin Creek?" The Sage Emperor shook his head. "Qin Chuan hasn't grown up yet. He can't threaten us. Even if Qin Chuan does grow up, given his temperament, he won't be much of a threat to us. From ancient times until now, there's always been one person who could threaten us." When Hui Chong heard the Sage Emperor's words, he couldn't help but think of a certain person that both the Sage Emperor and Qin Chuan had mentioned. The ancient human Emperor Yu. So many years have passed, but Yu is still alive. He's even become the ruler of the Void Empire. No one knows how strong Yu has become. He is the greatest threat to us, the true enemy. Hui Chong didn't know much about Yu, but the Sage Emperor knew Yu very well. Yu is an extremely conceited and ambitious person. If Yu was given a chance, then Yu would definitely make a comeback and complete what the ancient times had failed to do. He would unify the entire universe. At that time, no matter if it was the Sage Emperor, the Demon Emperor, or even Heaven and Atheists, they would all face two choices: submit to Yu or die. The chance for Yu to make a comeback was in Qin Chuan's hands. Kill Qin Chuan, and Yu would be freed. Both Qin Chuan and Yu were their enemies. If the Sage Emperor had to choose between Qin Chuan and Yu, then he would definitely choose Qin Chuan. Chapter 1378. At this moment, Hui Qian finally understood the Saint Emperor's meaning. He knew why the Saint Emperor would let Qin Chuan go. If he was a ferocious beast trapped in a cage, then Qin Chuan was the shackles on the cage. The existence of the shackles restricted the beast's movements. If they killed Qin Chuan, it would be equivalent to unlocking the shackles on the cage and releasing Yu, an enemy who had yet to grow up, and an enemy who had already become a universe supreme master. It was self-evident who was more of a threat. Therefore, they could not kill Qin Chuan. After Hui Qian understood this, he could not help but take a deep breath. He said to the Saint Emperor, "So, the questions you asked Qin Chuan before, about the rune sword and his strength, were just to determine how much of a restriction he could have on you?" The Saint Emperor lightly shook his head and said, "What I want to know is, if he is given more time, who is stronger between him and you?" Hearing the Saint Emperor's words, Hui Qian's face could not help but reveal a look of extreme shock. He said involuntarily, "You think that Qin Chuan can grow to the same height as you?" The Saint Emperor looked at Hui Qian and said indifferently, "Qin Chuan and you are the same. They both received help from the runic land and the runic sword. A few decades ago, Qin Chuan was just an ordinary person. Now, you have seen the height that Qin Chuan has reached. What makes you think that Qin Chuan cannot grow to the same height as you?" Hui Qian heard the Saint Emperor's words and was actually speechless. After a long time, she said to the Saint Emperor, "But Zadie from the Void Empire is about to arrive. So what if he arrives? I am not afraid of him." The Saint Emperor said calmly, "Let him deal with Qin Chuan. Whether he kills Qin Chuan or is killed by Qin Chuan, it has nothing to do with us." Hui Qian frowned and said, "Then what about the war not long after? How should we deal with it?" The Saint Emperor glanced at Grey Castle. "Do you really think that after Qin Chuan leaves the Sage Monarch continent, he'll let the righteous army continue to attack the Holy Cluster?" Hui Qian answered instinctively, "No. Therefore, the war will not break out. Even if it does, it will have nothing to do with us. It will be a war between Qin Chuan and Zadie. In other words, it will be the first battle between Qin Chuan and you." The Sage Emperor looked into the distance, his gaze piercing through the layers of obstacles to the teleportation channel that had just opened. He had a premonition that the universe, which had just calmed down for a moment, would soon become chaotic again. Qin Xuan left the Sage Monarch continent without any obstructions. In fact, he suspected that other than the Saint Emperor and Hui Qian, no one else was aware of his arrival. After leaving the Sage Monarch continent, Qin Xuan couldn't help but look back at it. To him, the Sage Monarch continent was like the mouth of an abyss that Qin Xuan had only escaped by sheer luck. The Saint Emperor really didn't chase after me. Did he just let me go, or did he want me to fall into despair again? Qin Xuan frowned. Considering how strong the Saint Emperor was, even if he had left the Sage Monarch continent, he could have easily caught up to him and killed him. But the fact that he hadn't done so was very strange. It doesn't matter if the Saint Emperor wants to kill me or not. I need to get this information out. Having reached this point in his train of thought, Qin Xuan pulled out a photonic computer from his ring of holding and contacted Chen Changxing, who was on planet Chaos Stone. The moment the call was connected, Chen Changxing's pleasantly surprised voice was heard from the other side. "Is that really you, boss? Is it you?" Qin Xuan replied, "It's me. I'm heading back to planet Chaos Stone. Also, don't attack the Holy Cluster." Chen Changxing had been very happy to hear that Qin Xuan was coming back, but when he heard that Qin Xuan wasn't going to attack the Holy Cluster, his expression turned very serious. "Boss," he said, "don't tell me the Saint Emperor is really a paragon." "That's right," Yang Qi replied. "The Saint Emperor is a paragon. Furthermore, this is a very complicated situation. I'll explain everything to everyone when I get back." Although Qin Xuan didn't think the Saint Emperor would lie to him, he still didn't fully trust him. There were some things that Qin Xuan wanted to wait until he got back. "All right, boss. Come back as soon as possible. We'll be waiting for you." Chen Changxing didn't ask further. If Qin Xuan wanted to tell him something, he wouldn't have to ask. He would tell him naturally. After Chen Changxing ended the call with Qin Xuan, he immediately gathered all the higher-ups of the Division of Justice. When everyone arrived at the meeting room, Chen Changxing immediately said, "Everyone, boss contacted me just now." When everyone heard Chen Changxing's words, they immediately asked about Qin Xuan's situation out of concern. The meeting room instantly became noisy. Chen Changxing slammed the table a few times before he managed to calm everyone down. "Everyone quiet down. Listen to me." Chen Changxing looked at everyone and said, "Boss is very safe now. He's already on his way back to planet Chaos Stone. I've gathered everyone not because of this matter, but because boss told me not to attack the Holy Cluster." At this point, Chen Changxing's expression became serious. "Boss told us not to attack the Holy Cluster. You should all know what this means." Everyone was shocked when they heard Chen Changxing's words. Although they had already guessed that the Saint Emperor had successfully become a supreme existence, they were still shocked when the truth was right in front of them. The Saint Emperor's promotion to a supreme existence meant that Zerg had two supreme existences. One should never underestimate the deterrent power of an ultimate existence. With one more ultimate existence among the Zerg, the advantage they would have when facing the celestial race and the one god sect was absolutely overwhelming. "Is this news true?" Tiansen looked at Chen Changxing solemnly. If this was true, then Zerg didn't have to retreat at all. He could have destroyed the entire Tian people in the Battle of the Iki Nebula. However, the Saint Emperor didn't do so. There were only two possibilities for this situation. The first possibility was that the Saint Emperor hadn't become a supreme existence. This was false, but since Qin Xuan had sent back the news, it meant that this news was true. The second possibility was that the Sky Emperor might also be a supreme existence. Tiansen couldn't think of a better explanation. Chapter 1379. In response to Tiansan's question, Chen Changxing replied, "That's what boss said, and that's what I've conveyed to everyone. If you have any questions, you can ask boss when he returns." Everyone had already calmed down from their shock. Luzi looked at Chen Changxing with a subtle gaze and asked, Did Qin Chuan say if we can contact him? Chun Changxing was taken aback for a moment and said, he didn't say that, but you can try. Lucy didn't say anything else and directly opened her photon computer to contact Qin Chuan. However, Qin Chuan was currently traveling through another space and couldn't answer Lucy's call request. Lucy saw that Qin Chuan didn't answer the call, so she temporarily gave up on contacting Qin Chuan. She looked at Chun Changxing and asked, did Qin Chuan say anything else? Chun Changxing replied, Boss also said that he'll explain in detail what happened during this period of time to everyone when he returns. Hearing Chun Changxing's answer, Lucy nodded slightly and said, in that case, we'll wait patiently for Qin Chuan to return. Tian Xin nodded and agreed. That's right. We can wait for Qin Chuan to return before we talk about other things. Now, I need to pass on the news that the Holy Emperor has become a paragon existence to the clan. At the same time, I need to confirm something. Everyone understood Tian San's meaning. Since the Holy Emperor had become a paragon existence, then the Sky Emperor had most likely become a paragon existence as well. Otherwise, there was no way to explain why the Holy Emperor, as a paragon existence, didn't make a move during the Battle of the Iki Nebula. I also need to pass on this news to the Divine Master, Saint Baudelaire said slowly. This news was too shocking and had to be passed on to the Divine Master as soon as possible. Then, the Divine Master would pass on the news to the only true God, Atheus. Stansos, Area 1. Celestial Emperor, who was dressed in linen clothes, had a bucket in his left hand and a ladle in his right. He was watering the vegetable garden at a leisurely pace. Every vegetable in the garden had been planted by Celestial Emperor himself. He had also raised them himself, including the weeds. When the Celestial Emperor planted vegetables, he would not purposely remove the weeds. Tian people always paid attention to nature. If the weeds could grow in the vegetable garden, then they would let them grow. When a vegetable garden was replanted, then they would remove the weeds. Just as the Sky Emperor finished watering the first bucket of water and was about to fill the second bucket, Tian San's message was sent to his optical computer. The Sky Emperor lowered his head and looked at the optical computer on his wrist that was stained with mud. He put down the bucket and ladle in his hands, wiped the water off his hands, and turned on the optical computer. As soon as he picked up the call, Tian San's voice came through. Celestial Emperor, Qin Chuan has sent back news that the Holy Emperor has ascended to the pinnacle. The Sky Emperor did not show any surprise at Tian San's words. He had already guessed this, and now it was confirmed. Compared to the others who were shocked, the Sky Emperor was much calmer. I understand. In that case, we will temporarily suspend the plan to attack the Holy Cluster. The Sky Emperor replied calmly. Since it was confirmed that the Holy Emperor had ascended to the pinnacle, continuing to attack the Holy Cluster would be suicidal. Tian San hesitated for a moment, then asked, Celestial Emperor, have you also ascended to the pinnacle? After hearing Tian San's question, Sky Emperor remained silent for a moment before replying, no. The simple answer left Tian San stunned. The Sky Emperor had not ascended to the pinnacle? But in the Battle of the Iki Nebula, you deliberately allowed yourself to be captured by Zerg. Wasn't that to test the Holy Emperor's strength? If you were not a pinnacle, wouldn't it be fatal for you to test the Holy Emperor like that? Tian San found it hard to understand. If the Sky Emperor was not a pinnacle, why would he be so bold? In response to Tian San's question, the Sky Emperor once again answered, at that time, I had the courage to test the Sage Emperor because I was blessed by the heavens. Blessed by the heavens. As the ruler of the Tian people, the Sky Emperor was the only one among the Tian people who could communicate with the heavens. If the Sky Emperor had communicated with the heavens before testing the Holy Emperor and received the heavens' blessing, then it would explain why the Sky Emperor was not afraid of the Holy Emperor. Although this explanation made Tian San feel that it was reasonable, this was not the explanation that Tian San wanted to hear. Sky Emperor, what realm are you at now? Tian San was very curious. What realm was the Sky Emperor at now? Was he only a demigod? Tribulation passing stage. The Sky Emperor's answer was completely out of Tian San's expectations. The Sky Emperor was only at the tribulation passing stage? Not even a demigod? How could this be? Tian-san found it hard to understand. Why was the Sky Emperor not even a demigod? The Sky Emperor did not think there was anything wrong with this. He replied, I am still at the tribulation passing stage because I have no way to become a demigod. I was chosen by the heavens, the fourth generation of the Sky Emperor. The fourth generation of the Sky Emperor. Tian-san was shocked again. He did not expect the Sky Emperor to be chosen by the heavens, the future fourth generation of the Sky Emperor. No wonder the Sky Emperor was always at the tribulation passing stage. Before the fall of the Sky Emperor, he could not become a demigod. Tian-san could not help but feel despair. He could not help but say, if this is the case, then Zerg is already in an invincible position with two pinnacle existences. The Sky Emperor replied, the Nephilim race has already withdrawn from this war. The Nephilim king will not interfere in this matter. Although Zerg has two pinnacle existences at the same time, we have the Sky Emperor and the Protoss as the one true god, atheists. They are enough to fight against Zerg. Tian-san's face could not help but show a touch of bitterness when he heard the Sky Emperor's words. Of course, he knew that the Sky Emperor and the one true god, atheists, were enough to fight against Zerg. However, their enemy was not only Zerg, but also the Void Empire. The Void Empire's expeditionary army had just been destroyed by them. The Void Empire would definitely not let this go so easily. They would definitely descend again. Previously, the Void Empire sent Fetitic and Narain, who were at the tribulation passing stage. After that, Kasisna was a demigod. After the fall of Kasisna and Void Empire, the Void Empire would give birth to another pinnacle existence equivalent to a pinnacle existence. If the Void Empire sent another powerhouse to descend again, it should be this new pinnacle existence. In this case, Zerg and the Void Empire would have the combat power of three pinnacle existences if they joined forces. The Sky Emperor and the one true god, atheists, would not be a match for them no matter what. Chapter 1380. A month had passed since the righteous army had declared war on the Holy Cluster. Everyone was paying close attention to the righteous army, waiting for them to launch an attack on the Holy Cluster. The residents of the Holy Cluster were also waiting anxiously for war to come. But to everyone's surprise, the righteous army had yet to launch an attack on the Holy Cluster. It was almost as if their declaration from a month ago had been nothing more than a joke. The righteous army's lack of action caused a lot of discussion among the residents of the Holy Cluster. Some believed that the righteous army wasn't fully prepared, while others believed that they were just bluffing. They didn't dare to attack the Holy Cluster, and that the atmosphere of war they had been trying to create over the past month was nothing more than a facade. Their goal was to force the leaders of Zerg to bow their heads and admit defeat like the devils. A few days later, Qin Chuan was back on planet Chaos Stone through an interstellar teleportation portal. After returning to messy Rockstar, Qin Chuan immediately went to see Chen Changxing. He had Chen Changxing gather all the higher-ups for a meeting. Chen Changxing told everyone that Qin Chuan had returned, and they all gathered in a meeting room. 5 minutes later, everyone sat down in front of Qin Chuan and began asking questions about Qin Chuan's trip to the Sage Monarch continent. In the face of everyone's enthusiasm and concern, Qin Chuan smiled and said, "Everyone, be quiet and listen to me." Hearing Qin Chuan's words, the excited and curious crowd finally calmed down. They all looked at Qin Chuan, waiting for him to explain. Qin Chuan looked around and said, "What I'm going to tell you next is about the meeting. First of all, there's one thing I want to say. The Saint Emperor really did reach the Paragon level. I saw it with my own eyes. There's no mistake about it." Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Tian-sen looked at Qin Chuan with an extremely complicated gaze and said, "You saw it with your own eyes? Does that mean you managed to escape from the Saint Emperor?" When everyone heard Tian-san's words, they were all stunned for a moment. Soon after, their faces were filled with extreme shock. Qin Chuan had actually managed to escape from the Saint Emperor? Didn't that mean that Qin Chuan was strong enough to contend with a paragon? Even if he could barely resist, it was still shocking enough. Qin Chuan smiled wryly at the looks of disbelief on everyone's faces. It's not as you think. Chen Changxing looked at him suspiciously. Then what is it? Qin Chuan sighed. I really did face to face with the Saint Emperor. I was only a few thousand meters away, but he didn't do anything to me. So, rather than saying that I escaped from the Saint Emperor, it's better to say that the Saint Emperor let me go. Everyone was stunned by Qin Chuan's explanation. The Saint Emperor let Qin Chuan go? How is that possible? Facing the shocked expressions of the crowd, Qin Chuan helplessly said, I know it's hard for you to believe, but what I said is the truth. At that time, I fell into the Sage Emperor's trap and was already a turtle in a jar. As long as the Sage Emperor was willing, he could have killed me at any time. But he only asked me a few questions and answered a few of them before letting me go. Lu Zi was surprised by Qin Chuan's words. Are you sure the person you saw was the Saint Emperor? With Lu Zi's understanding of the Saint Emperor, as well as the grudge between them and Zerg, if the Saint Emperor really had the chance to kill Qin Chuan, there was no reason for him to give up. Unless the person who saw Qin Chuan wasn't the Saint Emperor. Lu Zi wasn't the only one who doubted whether the person Qin Chuan saw was the Saint Emperor. In their eyes, there was no reason for the Saint Emperor to let Qin Chuan go. In the face of everyone's questions, Qin Chuan replied, I can confirm that person is the Sage Emperor. But if it really was the Saint Emperor, why would he let you go? Zhou Lin looked at Qin Chuan and suddenly asked, Do you still remember where we first met? Hearing Zhou Lin's baffling question, Qin Chuan didn't know whether to laugh or cry and said, The first time we met was in your father's training room. At that time you thought I was a thief. Senior sister, don't tell me you suspect that I have been possessed? Hearing Qin Chuan answer this question that only the two of them knew, Zhou Lin was puzzled and said, Since you are still Qin Chuan and haven't been possessed, then the person who was possessed must be the Saint Emperor. In any case, I don't believe that the Saint Emperor would choose to let you go when he had the chance to kill you. I also don't believe it. Yarao looked at Qin Chuan. Her heart was filled with doubt. Saint Botolo looked at Qin Chuan and said, Carefully recall if you have missed any details. With the enmity between you and Zerg, there is no reason for the Saint Emperor to let you go, unless he has some reason to let you go. Hearing Saint Botolo's words, Qin Chuan couldn't help but fall into contemplation. Seeing Qin Chuan pondering, other people didn't disturb him and patiently waited. Qin Chuan tried hard to recall everything that happened when he met the Saint Emperor. He didn't miss a single detail. After thinking for a long time, he finally thought of a possibility. Qin Chuan looked at everyone, pursed his lips, and said, If there is any reason for the Saint Emperor to let me go, then it is probably because of you. You? Hearing Qin Chuan suddenly mention you, everyone was somewhat surprised. Could it be that Yu is secretly protecting Qin Chuan? But is this possible? Right when everyone was wondering if there was a definite connection between the two of them, LVZ had already understood the crux of the matter. She took a deep glance at Qin Chuan and said, What you're saying is that the reason the Saint Emperor didn't kill you is because he hopes to rely on you to restrain you, right? Hearing Lu Zi's words, Qin Chuan nodded and replied, Yes, that's what I think. Moreover, there's a high probability that this is also the Saint Emperor's idea. After hearing the conversation between Qin Chuan and Lu Zi, everyone only needed to use their brain to understand the key point. Qin Chuan and you have too many similarities. Spiritual strength, space law, time law, all of these are too similar. If Qin Chuan is alive, you will never be able to fully control the space and time law, and will never be able to become the great existence that is close to the God of creation. But once Qin Chuan dies, you will be able to seize everything of Qin Chuan and fulfill his many years of dream. Once you takes that step, then with Yu's personality, he will definitely sweep the world and unify the universe. And this is what the Saint Emperor didn't want to see, so he chose to let Qin Chuan go. Chapter 1381. After everyone understood the crux of the matter, the expressions on their faces became somewhat subtle. Everyone agreed with this conjecture in their hearts, because they could not think of a better reason than this. After all, this matter sounded too outrageous. Who would have thought that the Sage Emperor would let Qin Xuan go because of you? When Qin Xuan told everyone about the origin of the grudge between the human race and Zerg, everyone's expressions could not help but become extremely strange. Zerg had always been against the human race, and even when the human race had retreated to the land of exile, he was still unwilling to let the human race go, and it was all because of a small issue of address. No wonder the Sage Emperor let you go. Although he hates you and wants to kill you, his hatred for you is nothing compared to his hatred for you. St. Bottle sighed. He really did not expect that the origin of the grudge between the human race and Zerg would be so melodramatic. If you knew that the Sage Emperor let Qin Xuan go because of a small issue of address, who knew if he would vomit blood in anger? When Qin Xuan heard St. Bottle's words, he hesitated for a moment. He did not say anything about the one true God, atheists. He planned to wait until after the meeting to discuss this matter with St. Bottle alone. The Sage Emperor asked Qin Xuan so many questions, presumably to confirm whether Qin Xuan has the ability to restrict you. If Qin Xuan does not have this ability, the Sage Emperor will definitely not let Qin Xuan go. Luzi looked at Qin Xuan and could not help but rejoice. If Qin Xuan was not outstanding enough, perhaps Qin Xuan would be a dead man by now. Qin Xuan had already told the Sage Emperor everything that could be said except for the runic sword, including the insect queen's transformation into a divine artifact. Tian San was originally worried that Zerg had two ultimate existences at the same time, but when he heard Qin Xuan say that the insect queen had become a semi-finished divine artifact, and that its consciousness had fallen into a deep slumber, his anxious heart immediately relaxed. Before the insect queen's consciousness awakened, it was at best a demigod artifact, and its deterrence was limited. In this way, the difference between the Tian people and Zerg was not that big. Qin Xuan, since Zerg currently only has the Sage Emperor, why should we give up on attacking the Holy Cluster? Tian Sin did not understand. With the Sage Emperor's strength and a demigod artifact, he should not be a match for heaven and the only true God, atheists. Qin Xuan looked at Tian San and said, Elder Tian San, things are not as simple as you think. The insect queen's consciousness has fallen into a deep slumber, not because it cannot wake up, but because the Sage Emperor has no intention of waking it up. Once we continue to attack the Holy Cluster and make the Sage Emperor feel pressured, he will definitely awaken the insect queen. At that time, I'm afraid that our gains will not make up for the losses. Tian San's expression changed slightly when he heard Qin Xuan's explanation. The Sage Emperor has a way to awaken the insect queen. Qin Xuan said hesitantly, That's my guess. Although I may be wrong, we can't afford to gamble. Although they would not gain anything if they did not move, they would not lose anything either. However, if they continued to attack the Holy Cluster, it would be fine if the insect queen did not wake up. But once it did, they would be in deep trouble. You're right to be worried, Tian Sin said to Qin Xuan. I've underestimated the situation. Then what should we do now? Huang Feng, who had been silent all this time, suddenly asked, Should we disband? Everyone turned to look at Qin Xuan when they heard Huang Feng's question. Whether the Army of Justice should disband or not depended on Qin Xuan's opinion. Qin Xuan pondered for a moment before saying, We can't disband for the time being because we still don't know how the Void Empire will react. They had just wiped out the 6 billion troops of the Void Empire Expeditionary Army not long ago. After the Void Empire had swallowed such a bitter pill, there was no reason for them to pretend that nothing had happened. Therefore, the Void Empire would definitely descend again, and the war would definitely break out again. If they waited until the Void Empire descended and the war broke out, it would probably be too late to mobilize the troops. The outside world is still waiting for us to attack the Holy Cluster. Chen Changxing grinned and said, Then let's set up camp on Rocky Star for the time being. Qin Xuan shook his head and said, Rocky Star is not suitable for defense. Let's move the army back to the Iki Nebula and let the original garrison stay on Rocky Star. Then should we announce something to the outside world? Chen Changxing looked at Qin Chuan and said, "We can't just do nothing, right?" Qin Chuan thought for a moment and said, "Let's just do nothing. We'll ignore the outside world for the time being." In fact, not making any response was the best response, because it was not appropriate for them to tell the outside world that they had given up attacking the Holy Cluster or to continue attacking the Holy Cluster. Therefore, they could only remain silent. The meeting was over, and everyone had to go back to report the news that Qin Chuan had brought back to the people behind them. Qin Chuan took the opportunity, when no one was paying attention to him, to quietly find Saint Baudelot. Saint Baudelot was not surprised by Qin Chuan's quiet visit. He smiled at Qin Chuan and said, "When we were in the conference room, I saw you hesitating to speak to me. I thought it was just my imagination. I didn't expect you to really have something to say to me in private." As a supreme existence in the tribulation stage, Saint Baudelot's observation skills were extremely outstanding. The subtle details that Qin Chuan had shown were not hidden from him. He believed that many people had also noticed Qin Chuan's performance at that time, but no one said anything. Qin Chuan looked at Saint Baudelot and asked directly, "Pope, when did you join the One God religion?" Saint Baudelot looked at Qin Chuan with a little surprise, and then replied, 2,700 years ago. Qin Chuan heard Saint Baudelot's answer and asked again, "How much do you know about the one true God, atheists?" Hearing Qin Chuan mention the one true God, atheists, the expression on Saint Baudelot's face suddenly became serious, and he asked in a deep voice, "You also talked about the one true God, atheists, when you met the Holy Emperor this time?" Qin Chuan nodded and said, "Yes, it's about the one true God, atheists. That's why I didn't say it directly in the conference room just now. I wanted to talk to you in private." Saint Baudelot was silent for a moment, and then he said to Qin Chuan, "I don't know much about the one true God, atheists, because I've never seen him." Chapter 1382. Hearing Saint Baudelot's answer, Qin Chuan couldn't help but reveal in his expected expression. Saint Baudelot was the Pope of the One God religion and had a lofty status. Even he didn't know much about the one true God atheists, let alone the other members of the One God religion and the Protoss. Qin Chuan took a deep look at Saint Baudelot and asked, "Do you know the origin of the one true God atheists?" Saint Baudelot slightly frowned and said, "The one true God atheist is the ancestor of the Protoss. Is there a problem with this?" Hearing Saint Baudelot's answer, Qin Chuan's expression couldn't help but become somewhat subtle. He said to Saint Baudelot, "I heard a different version from the Sage Emperor." "What version?" Saint Baudelot looked at Qin Chuan. For some reason, he felt a faint uneasiness in his heart. Qin Chuan pursed his lips and said, "The Sage Emperor told me that the one true God atheist is not the ancestor of the Protoss." Saint Baudelot couldn't help but reveal a look of shock when he heard Qin Chuan's words. He cried out involuntarily, "That's impossible." Seeing Saint Baudelot so agitated, Qin Chuan hurriedly said to him, "Don't get agitated. Let me finish. You're wrong. The Sage Emperor must be deceiving you. That's impossible." Saint Baudelot wasn't in the mood to listen to Qin Chuan at this time, because Qin Chuan's words must have shaken his faith of more than 2,000 years. As a faithful believer of the one true God atheist, his worldview was on the verge of collapse. Seeing Saint Baudelot so agitated, Qin Chuan had no choice but to temporarily suppress Saint Baudelot with his powerful psychic power. After Saint Baudelot's emotions gradually stabilized, he continued, "The one true God atheist is not the ancestor of the Protoss, but the artifact spirit of the artifact created by the Protoss." After hearing Qin Chuan's explanation, Saint Baudelot couldn't help but fall into a trance. The one true God atheist is the artifact spirit. That's impossible. Saint Baudelot muttered in a low voice, his eyes unfocused, as if his spiritual world had suffered a great impact. His aura also became extremely unstable and showed signs of qi deviation. Seeing this, Qin Chuan had no choice but to suppress Saint Bottle, who had fallen into a coma. He couldn't help but sigh of Saint Bottle. If he knew this would happen, he wouldn't have been so anxious to tell Saint Bottle this matter. If he knew this result, he wouldn't have told Saint Bottle. Saint Bottle, as the Pope, doesn't know the origin of the one true God atheist. Then, does the divine Lord Apollo know about this matter? Qin Chuan hesitated for a moment and finally decided not to contact the divine Lord Apollo for the time being. He had just caused the Pope of the one true God religion to fall into a state of madness. If he caused the divine Lord to fall into a state of confusion, he would be guilty of a great sin. On the other side, Tian San had already passed on the news that Qin Chuan had brought back to the Sky Emperor. After hearing Tian San's account, the Sky Emperor's expression was obscure, making it difficult to tell whether he was happy or angry. After a long time, he said to Tian San, "I understand. Just do as Qin Chuan said. Temporarily give up attacking the Holy Cluster and return to the Iki Nebula." Tian San hesitated for a moment, then said, "Emperor of Heaven, do you really think the Saint Emperor has a way to awaken the Broodmother's consciousness, but he's not doing so?" The Sky Emperor nodded. The Broodmother is a supreme existence and has existed for millions upon millions of years. Before turning herself into a god item, there's no way she wouldn't have made any preparations. If she wasn't absolutely certain, she wouldn't have taken that step. Therefore, it's highly likely that the Saint Emperor has a way to awaken her. He just hasn't done it yet. Hearing the Sky Emperor's answer, Tian San couldn't help but sigh. This matter is really too complicated. If it's too complicated, don't overthink it, the Sky Emperor said coolly. Even if the sky falls, there are tall people to hold it up. There's no need to worry too much. Yes, I understand. Sage Monarch Continent. The Saint Emperor stood at the top of a mountain, looking up silently at the teleportation portal above him. Behind the Saint Emperor, Huicho was also looking up at the portal. However, compared to the Saint Emperor, Huicho's expression was a lot more complicated. In the past, Huicho had always believed that they were on the same side as the Void Empire. But after what had happened the other day, she realized that the people she had always believed to be her allies were actually her greatest enemies. Has our sacred race always been fighting alone? Huiqian muttered to himself as he gazed at the Saint Emperor's back, his thoughts running wild. The Saint Emperor said, "Experts don't need friends. That's because no one is qualified to be their friend. Aside from enemies, everyone else is a vassal." Hearing the Saint Emperor's reply, Huiqian asked again, "What about us? Vassals? Us?" The Saint Emperor said with a cold laugh, "We're enemies." As soon as the Saint Emperor finished speaking, the portal in the sky suddenly lit up with a deep violet light. An enormous pressure began to spread out from the portal, and as the pressure grew stronger, a tall figure slowly emerged from the portal and landed in front of the Saint Emperor and Huicho. The newcomer wore a deep violet cloak, and his face was hidden. However, his aura was on the same level as the Saint Emperor's. In fact, it was even slightly stronger. When I started the teleportation, I kept thinking about what would happen to me if someone destroyed the teleportation channel before I finished the teleportation. I thought of dozens of ways to deal with it, but unfortunately, none of them came in handy. Zadier chuckled and walked up to the Saint Emperor. "I'm very satisfied with your performance." Gray Chong could not help but reveal a trace of displeasure when he heard Zadie's words. Although Zadie was a rank 1 expert, a Saint Emperor was also a supreme existence. Wasn't Zadie's attitude toward the Saint Emperor a little too casual? The Saint Emperor didn't mind Zadier's attitude. He looked at Zadier and asked, "You're Zadier, right?" Zadier nodded. "That's right. I'm Zadier. Although I'm much older than you, I've only ascended a tier 1 recently. I don't know who's the senior and who's the junior. Why don't we just treat each other as equals?" "As you wish," the Saint Emperor replied. He didn't care about seniority. He was more concerned about Zadier's intentions. Zadier looked around and said, "Although I've known about your universe for a long time, this is the first time I've come here personally. It feels pretty good." You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.